Betrayed and devoured in the first wave of a zombie apocalypse, Lu Chen awakens 1 month before the outbreak with every memory intact. This time, he prepares. Selling his family estate, he builds a hidden bunker and engineers his own evolution, deliberately infecting himself to gain power without losing control. As mutated apex entities rise and form terrifying hierarchies across China, Lu Chen hunts them one by one, dismantling networks, severing a continental anchor, and preventing organized extinction. From revenge-driven survivor to silent guardian, he reshapes the apocalypse itself, transforming a world doomed to fall into one balanced on fragile, hard-won equilibrium.
To catch up on the previous parts of this story, just check the links waiting for you in the description.
Chapter 1. When Lu Chen woke in his Beijing apartment with the phantom sensation of teeth tearing into his flesh, he did not gasp or question reality. He lay still beneath the familiar ceiling crack and let the memory settle like frost over his thoughts, recalling with perfect clarity the moment Wei Dong's hands shoved him backward into a swarm of gnashing mouths so his sworn brother could escape, and as the remembered agony pulsed through nerves that were no longer torn apart, he understood. Heaven had granted him something rarer than mercy. Time. One glance at the calendar confirmed it was exactly 1 month before the first sirens had wailed across China, before cities drowned in blood and panic, and instead of rage he felt only a glacial resolve crystallize within him, because this time he would not trust, would not hesitate, and would not die for anyone else's survival. By noon he began liquidating his assets. By night he had contacted discreet buyers for the ancestral tea estate in Sichuan under the pretense of expanding into international trade, and within days he converted property, stocks, and joint ventures, including those shared with Wei Dong, into silent, mobile capital, ignoring cheerful messages from Shanghai about investment plans and celebration dinners, because every memory of laughter now tasted like rot, as news reports murmured about isolated violent incidents dismissed as drug-induced hysteria. Lu Chen mapped supply chains instead of social visits, sourced contractors through layers of confidentiality, and selected a forgotten farmhouse deep within Sichuan's hills as the shell for a sanctuary beneath earth and reinforced steel, knowing that preparation, not hope, would determine who remained human when the world began to devour itself. Chapter 2. Construction began under the guise of seismic retrofitting, and Lu Chen oversaw every detail with unnerving calm, instructing crews to excavate far deeper than necessary while reinforced concrete walls were poured thick enough to withstand not merely earthquakes but sustained assault. And beneath the farmhouse emerged a hidden complex of narrow corridors, storage vaults, water purification systems, and an independent solar array linked to layered battery banks, each system redundant. Because failure meant death, he installed biometric locks, thermal cameras, and a hydraulic hatch disguised above ground as agricultural equipment storage, ensuring no casual observer would suspect the fortress below, while shipments of freeze-dried grains, medical supplies, antibiotics, heirloom seeds, fuel cells, and tools arrived steadily under coded invoices that masked their scale. At night he studied archived outbreak data from his previous life, analyzing infection patterns and the rare rumors of individuals who had survived exposure only to emerge changed, stronger, faster, something beyond ordinary human limits, and he recorded hypotheses in encrypted files labeled simply Phase 2. Meanwhile Wei Dong flooded social media with images of rooftop bars and imported cars, complaining jokingly about Lu Chen's sudden seriousness, unaware that joint investments had quietly shifted ownership and that every yuan he spent would soon become meaningless paper. When scattered reports of cannibalistic attacks surfaced online, dismissed again by officials as isolated madness, Lu Chen merely checked another item from his list and transferred the final payment to his contractors, dismissing them with generous bonuses and stern non-disclosure agreements, then driving alone toward Sichuan beneath a sky that felt heavy with approaching catastrophe, his heart steady not with fear but anticipation. Chapter 3. The first national siren tore through the quiet hills at dawn, long and unbroken, echoing across farmland as Lu Chen stood inside the bunker's control room watching live feeds of highways collapsing into chaos, vehicles colliding as infected attackers surged through stalled traffic with impossible ferocity, and without hesitation he sealed the hydraulic hatch, steel bolts slamming into place as ventilation systems shifted to closed-cycle filtration. Emergency broadcasts crackled for 3 days before dissolving into static, and through external cameras he observed neighboring villages succumb in waves, screams fading into silence broken only by wandering figures stained dark with blood, while he rationed food with mathematical precision and maintained strict exercise routines to prevent physical decline, refusing the luxury of shock. On the fourth evening motion sensors flared red as a lone figure staggered toward the disguised hatch, gaunt and desperate, and even before The face lifted toward the camera. Lu Chen recognized Wei Dong, stripped of arrogance, clothes torn, pounding against hidden steel while shouting promises of loyalty and shared brotherhood, claiming he had searched everywhere, that Shanghai had fallen overnight, that only Lu Chen had ever truly been family. Memories of betrayal surfaced not as pain but as cold arithmetic, and when Wei Dong collapsed sobbing against the unyielding metal, shadows gathering behind him at the tree lean, Lu Chen reached for the intercom switch, paused only long enough to confirm the distant shapes converging, then turned the system off entirely, extinguishing even the possibility of response, because in this life mercy was not virtue but extinction. Chapter 4 Wei Dong's screams escalated as the infected emerged from the trees, first one, then several, drawn by desperation and noise, and through muted cameras Lu Chen watched his former brother attempt to flee only to stumble from exhaustion, disappearing beneath a frenzy of clawing bodies that shook the frame before static consumed the feed. He powered the monitor down without replay and stood alone in the humming control room, acknowledging not grief but closure, because the past had demanded its debt and he had refused payment. Once external movement dissipated, he initiated Phase 2, preparing the isolation chamber he had constructed beside the airlock, a sterile steel-lined room equipped with restraints, medical scanners, and negative pressure ventilation, designed for a purpose no ordinary survivor would contemplate. From memory he recalled that in rare cases prolonged exposure did not immediately produce mindless decay but a transitional fever during which cellular mutation accelerated, and those few who endured without losing sanity exhibited enhanced strength and resilience before inevitably being hunted down or succumbing to instability. Lu Chen intended to refine that window rather than stumble into it, so he lured a lone infected into a perimeter snare using timed sound emitters and extracted blood samples via mechanical arm to avoid direct contact, studying the darkened fluid beneath microscope lenses as abnormal cell structures pulsed faintly with aggressive vitality, and while distant howls echoed through Sichuan's valleys he began calibrating dilution ratios, aware that the line between evolution and self-destruction would be measured in milliliters. Chapter 5 The syringe rested against his forearm for only a moment before Lu Chen pressed it in, injecting a carefully filtered strain derived from infected plasma, then securing his wrists to reinforced restraints within the isolation chamber as biometric monitors flickered to life, tracking every fluctuation in heart rhythm and neural activity. The reaction was immediate and merciless, fever surging beyond 40 degrees as muscles convulsed beneath his skin and veins darkened in branching patterns that pulsed like living circuitry, pain eclipsing even the memory of being devoured. Yet he clenched his jaw and focused on structured thoughts, geography, mathematics, inventory lists, anchors against the rising tide of instinct urging surrender. Hours blurred into delirium as bones seemed to compress and rebuild from within, nerve endings igniting in synchronized storms until at last the cascade slowed instead of spiraling into organ failure, and when dawn filtered faintly through reinforced vents he realized he was still breathing, heartbeat slower yet stronger, senses sharpening to detect the faint vibration of wind against distant soil. With deliberate effort he strained against the restraints and felt steel groan before bending inward under sustained pressure rather than frantic struggle, confirming measurable strength increase without cognitive collapse. And as he freed himself and recorded stabilized vitals, exhaustion heavy but mind intact, a thin smile touched his lips because he had crossed the first threshold willingly and returned not as victim nor monster, but as something balanced between, ready to carve survival from a world descending into ruin. Chapter 6 Recovery lasted 2 days, though exhaustion could not suppress the restless energy coursing beneath Lu Chen's skin, and once his temperature normalized he began structured trials inside the reinforced corridor of the bunker, measuring grip strength against hydraulic gauges that now bent under pressure once unimaginable, sprinting timed intervals that blurred the narrow passage into streaks of steel and shadow, and inflicting controlled cuts along his forearm to observe tissue regeneration that sealed shallow wounds within hours rather than days. Caloric demand doubled, forcing recalibration of ration projections and acceleration of hydroponic growth cycles, yet he accepted the cost as necessary fuel for transformation, and when night fell he ventured cautiously above ground for the first time since the injection, moving through farmland with heightened perception that separated distant rustling from infected shuffles with unsettling clarity. A wandering corpse lunged from behind a collapsed fence, but instead of retreating he sidestepped with fluid precision and drove a reinforced spear through its skull in one controlled motion, withdrawing before contaminated blood could touch exposed skin, his breathing steady, emotions muted beneath analytical focus. Afterward he stood beneath the starless sky listening to the hollow silence of a broken countryside and recognized that fear no longer held dominion over him, replaced instead by calculation sharpened to a blade's edge, and as he returned to the bunker he logged a single conclusion: the first evolution had stabilized successfully, but adaptation must continue, because the infected would not remain stagnant while he alone advanced. Chapter 7 days later he observed a disturbing anomaly along a dried irrigation canal 2 kilometers west, where a lone infected stood upright rather than hunched, its posture unnervingly composed as it scanned the terrain with slow, deliberate turns of its head, and when a stray dog darted from brush the creature did not chase blindly but waited, muscles coiling before launching forward in a burst of speed rivaling Lu Chen's own, snapping the animal's spine with calculated efficiency. Through magnified optics he studied its movements and identified behavioral deviations, anticipatory pauses, obstacle avoidance, even strategic retreat from open sunlight, suggesting neurological restructuring beyond basic mutation, and he designated it variant alpha in his encrypted log, understanding immediately that the evolutionary race extended beyond human survivors. Instead of immediate confrontation he deployed remote DART systems to collect blood samples during a carefully staged distraction. Barely avoiding a slashing counterattack that gouged sparks from his reinforced forearm guard, and back inside the bunker laboratory he compared Alpha's cellular structure to earlier specimens, discovering denser neural clustering and amplified adrenal secretion patterns. The implication was clear: infected capable of tactical reasoning would emerge increasingly, and if he failed to surpass them his bunker would become tomb rather than fortress, so he began refining a second serum using Alpha's altered tissue, aware that escalation demanded risk greater than the first threshold he had crossed. Chapter 8 The second injection was measured in microdoses over 12 hours to prevent catastrophic overload, yet the reaction proved more violent than anticipated, his senses detonating outward in overlapping waves of sound and vibration that forced him to anchor consciousness through sheer will, veins darkening further as muscle fibers tightened into denser alignment and neural conductivity surged to levels that caused nearby electronic monitors to flicker under interference. Unlike the first transformation, this mutation did not merely enhance physical metrics but sharpened cognitive processing, allowing strategic projections to unfold with accelerated clarity, mapping terrain and threat probabilities in layered sequences without fatigue, though emotional detachment deepened in equal measure, dampening residual empathy into distant abstraction. When the storm subsided he rose slowly from the isolation cot and tested movement, discovering he could track subterranean vibrations through soil and distinguish separate footfalls across hundreds of meters, an ability that shifted combat from reactive to anticipatory. To validate enhancement he lured 3 infected into a narrow ravine and engaged them without traps, eliminating each in controlled succession while sustaining only superficial damage that regenerated before he returned underground. And as he cleaned his weapon beneath sterile light he acknowledged a subtle truth: humanity was no longer his baseline, but it remained his chosen anchor, and so long as his mind governed the mutation rather than surrendered to it, evolution would serve survival instead of erasing it. Chapter 9 Captain Zhao's armed unit entered his territory weeks later, disciplined remnants of a provincial response team retreating inland after urban collapse, and Lu Chen monitored their formation from concealed vantage points, noting efficient communication signals and strict ammunition control that distinguished them from panicked refugees. Rather than reveal himself he manipulated environmental variables, redirecting roaming infected clusters toward abandoned barns rigged with incendiary traps while guiding the unit away from his hidden perimeter through staggered noise emitters that suggested safer passage, preserving them as a living buffer against southern migration routes. However, internal tension within the group surfaced quickly as supplies dwindled and rumors spread of an unseen guardian influencing events, and when one scout ventured dangerously close to a concealed ventilation shaft Lu Chen intercepted him with silent precision, disarming and pinning him without lethal force before issuing a calm warning to maintain distance if survival mattered, releasing him unharmed to carry the message back. The calculated display achieved compliance without open conflict, reinforcing territorial boundaries while preserving their utility, yet Lu Chen remained aware that proximity to organized humans introduced unpredictability equal to evolving variants, and thus he updated evacuation contingencies even as he leveraged their presence to stabilize regional threat distribution. Chapter 10 The true escalation came when seismic monitors registered coordinated movement unlike previous hordes, converging vectors indicating multiple advanced variants operating in loose formation across southwestern ridges, and drone footage confirmed 3 upright figures guiding dense infected masses with unsettling synchronization, their paths gradually bending toward the farmhouse slope despite diversionary traps. Recognizing static defense would invite encirclement, Lu Chen executed a divide and erode strategy, activating high-frequency emitters tuned to neural sensitivities observed in Alpha's tissue to disrupt formation cohesion while triggering shaped charges within narrow ravines to fracture accompanying hordes, flames erupting in controlled arcs that shattered momentum. 2 variants perished beneath collapsing rock and fire, but the third adapted mid-chaos and charged uphill with calculated fury,
claws striking sparks from reinforced gauntlets as Lu Chen met it in.
Direct combat across memorized terrain, feigning imbalance near a concealed sink trench before triggering a kinetic spike that pierced through its torso and immobilized it long enough for a decisive cranial strike delivered with amplified strength. As the creature convulsed and stilled, a resonant pulse rippled through his nerves like distant thunder answering the kill, and standing amid smoke and ash he understood that something beyond isolated mutation had sensed the loss, suggesting a hierarchy forming within the plague, and that his path forward would lead not merely to survival, but to confrontation with whatever intelligence now stirred in the dark. Chapter 11. The pulse that followed the variant's death did not fade with distance but settled beneath Lu Chen's skin like a second rhythm, subtle yet persistent, intensifying whenever he faced southwest toward the forest reserve beyond his mapped perimeter, and within days abnormal structures appeared across that direction, infected corpses arranged in crude radial formations around empty centers, their limbs twisted inward as if in unconscious worship, behavior impossible without centralized influence. Drone reconnaissance revealed increasing concentrations of motion within the reserve's dried reservoir basin, where dozens of infected stood motionless in concentric rings rather than roaming, and at dusk a massive silhouette emerged from the basin's shadow, towering above prior variants with elongated limbs and layered musculature that flexed independently, its presence triggering synchronized twitch responses among surrounding hordes. Lu Chen suppressed the instinctive surge of aggression that urged immediate confrontation and instead retreated to analyze, recognizing that impulsive engagement against an unknown apex would squander strategic advantage, and back inside the bunker he cross-referenced alpha tissue data with resonance patterns he felt internally, hypothesizing that advanced mutations emitted low-frequency bioelectric signals detectable by similarly altered organisms, himself included. If true, then his evolution had made him visible in ways steel walls could not conceal, and survival required understanding not only physical strength but the network forming between apex entities. As he recalibrated perimeter defenses and plotted reconnaissance routes deeper into the reserve, he accepted a sobering conclusion: the plague was no longer chaos but system, and somewhere within that system a nucleus had begun to gather power comparable to his own. Chapter 12. Rather than abandon his bunker immediately, Lu Chen initiated mobile contingency protocols, preparing sealed supply caches along northern ridgelines and activating a concealed evacuation tunnel leading toward higher mountain terrain, yet he refused to relinquish strategic ground without confirming the apex's operational range, and under moonless cover he advanced toward the reservoir basin using terrain masking techniques refined over weeks of surveillance, minimizing electronic signature and suppressing outward bioelectric fluctuation through controlled breathing to dampen the resonance pulse beneath his veins. As he approached within visual range, he observed the massive variant, designated Prime, move with deliberate economy, not prowling but surveying, its head tilting slightly as if parsing invisible signals, and twice it redirected nearby infected with minimal gestures that resembled command rather than reflex. When a stray mutated hound wandered too close, Prime eliminated it instantly yet did not feed, suggesting territorial enforcement rather than hunger-driven behavior. Lu Chen recorded every motion from concealed elevation, mapping patrol cycles and subordinate response latency, and though the predatory instinct within him flared at the challenge, he recognized that defeating Prime would require layered attrition rather than singular confrontation, because unlike prior variants this entity possessed environmental awareness and potential network reach that could summon hordes from kilometers away. Withdrawing before detection, he returned underground with data sufficient to draft a multi-phase campaign, understanding that the coming conflict would determine whether he remained apex of his territory or became hunted within it. Chapter 13. Preparation consumed the next 72 hours as Lu Chen transformed surrounding geography into a fragmented kill zone, seeding narrow forest corridors with pressure-triggered fuel dispersal lines, reinforcing cliffside choke points with collapsible anchors, and installing experimental resonance disruptors tuned to frequencies extrapolated from his own neural patterns in hopes of destabilizing Prime's command cohesion. Simultaneously he transmitted encrypted warnings toward Captain Zhao's relocated plateau, advising immediate eastward migration under guise of imminent mass movement, offering coordinates without explanation to preserve secrecy while ensuring human variables would not be collateral damage in the approaching clash. Zhao complied after brief hesitation, retreating beyond projected conflict radius, and with civilian interference minimized. Lu Chen enacted Phase 1 by detonating diversionary charges along the reserve's southern flank, drawing lesser infected outward in chaotic surge while leaving Prime momentarily isolated at the basin core. As expected, the apex responded not with panic but recalibration, issuing subtle gestural commands that restructured the horde's vector toward the disturbance, yet the resonance disruptors activated simultaneously, fracturing synchronized motion into erratic confusion that delayed response time by critical seconds.
Using that window, Lu Chen descended from ridge to basin edge and launched a high-velocity
projectile aimed at Prime's cranial ridge, initiating a battle not of desperation but design, aware that each calculated strike would test the limits of both their evolutions and determine which pulse would ultimately dominate the hills of Sichuan. Chapter 14 Prime absorbed the initial impact with startling resilience, bone plating deflecting the projectile enough to prevent immediate incapacitation, and countercharged with explosive acceleration that cracked dry earth beneath its stride, forcing Lu Chen into lateral evasion across uneven terrain he had memorized precisely for this confrontation. Claws carved trenches through stone where he had stood moments before, yet each missed strike drew Prime incrementally toward embedded fuel lines concealed beneath sediment. And as Lu Chen feigned retreat across the basin's inner arc, he triggered staggered ignitions that erupted in controlled walls of flame, momentarily isolating the apex from subordinate reinforcements scrambling under disrupted command signals. Smoke thickened the air, but his enhanced lungs filtered efficiently while Prime's movements grew fractionally less coordinated amid sensory interference, and seizing that microsecond advantage he closed distance with reinforced spear angled beneath armored plating at the cervical junction, driving upward with amplified force that penetrated partially yet failed to sever critical structures, resulting in violent backlash that hurled him across scorched ground. Pain flared sharp but manageable, regeneration already stabilizing internal bruising, and as Prime roared, a guttural resonance that vibrated through his marrow. Lu Chen realized this would not end through traps alone but through sustained adaptation under pressure, demanding escalation beyond any previous threshold he had dared attempt. Chapter 15 Forced into direct engagement within the burning basin, Lu Chen abandoned remaining static triggers and shifted to kinetic warfare, exploiting his superior agility to target joint articulations while avoiding full-force clashes against Prime's raw power, each exchange measured in milliseconds where reflex and foresight intertwined, and gradually he identified a pattern within the apex's assaults: a fractional hesitation before lateral sweep, a microtilt of shoulder preceding overhand strike, predictive cues that allowed him to counter with increasing efficiency. Capitalizing on one such window, he vaulted onto Prime's back and embedded a compact resonance charge directly against exposed neural ridging at the base of its skull, then disengaged in a backward roll as the device detonated in concentrated pulse rather than flame, releasing disruptive frequency calibrated from his own mutation signature.
The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the apex, whose synchronized
control over surrounding infected shattered into chaotic spasms as it staggered, movements desynchronized and violent, and Lu Chen surged forward with final resolve, channeling augmented strength into a decisive thrust that pierced through compromised cranial plating and into the neural core, twisting until resistance ceased. As Prime collapsed, the subdermal pulse within Lu Chen surged once more before stabilizing into deeper,
steadier cadence, signaling not merely victory but absorption of
hierarchical dominance within the local mutation network. And standing amid smoke and silence, he understood that he had not only survived the apex's challenge but inherited its territory, ascending another rung in an evolutionary ladder that showed no sign of ending. Chapter 16 Prime's corpse lay smoldering at the basin center as scattered infected wandered without cohesion, their prior synchronization fractured beyond recovery, and Lu Chen remained vigilant until seismic monitors confirmed dispersal across multiple vectors rather than regrouping, only then approaching the fallen apex to harvest neural stem tissue denser and more complex than any prior specimen.
Unlike Alpha's samples, Prime's core exhibited layered filament structures branching outward
like conductive roots, still faintly active despite cranial destruction, and when he placed a gloved hand near the exposed tissue he felt a stabilizing resonance align with his internal pulse rather than conflict, suggesting successful dominance transfer within the localized mutation hierarchy. Transport required reinforced containment due to residual bioelectric discharge that interfered with nearby electronics, yet he secured the specimen and withdrew to the bunker before dawn, where he initiated extended analysis under sterile conditions, mapping synaptic density increases and identifying potential amplification pathways that could expand his sensory range beyond current kilometers. Despite exhaustion from prolonged combat, he resisted immediate integration, recognizing that each evolution carried cumulative strain, and instead monitored his physiological state for destabilization while observing external terrain through drones that now detected markedly reduced organized movement within the reserve. For the first time since rebirth, a measurable radius of relative stability surrounded his territory, not because the world had quieted but because he had eliminated its regional nucleus, and as he documented results he acknowledged that power acquired through conquest demanded restraint as much as ambition, for reckless ascent could trigger adaptation elsewhere beyond his surveillance. Chapter 17 Captain Zhao's unit, now relocated eastward, transmitted a cautious open band message 2 days after the basin battle, expressing awareness that a large-scale threat had been neutralized and requesting parley under controlled conditions, and Lu Chen weighed the proposition with calculated indifference before agreeing to a limited meeting at a neutral ridgeline visible from multiple vantage points.
He arrived unarmed in appearance yet fully capable, posture composed as Zhao stepped
forward with equal discipline, their exchange devoid of theatrics as they acknowledged mutual survival benefits established through indirect cooperation. Zhao proposed structured information exchange regarding migrating hordes in distant military enclaves rumored to persist inland, while Lu Chen imposed strict boundaries, no approach within predefined perimeter, no attempts to track or follow,
and immediate relocation should large-scale mutation convergence reoccur. The captain, pragmatic
rather than prideful, accepted terms, recognizing superiority not merely in strength but in foresight, and the brief alliance crystallized into functional coexistence where Zhao's scouts relayed macro-level movement data while Lu Chen supplied encrypted warnings when resonance anomalies indicated rising threats. Though trust remained absent, utility prevailed, and as they parted without handshake or sentiment,
Lu Chen acknowledged that human variables, when managed precisely, could enhance
regional stability without compromising autonomy, provided emotional entanglement never resurfaced to cloud judgment as it once had with Wei Dong. Chapter 18 Analysis of Prime's neural core revealed a dormant amplification potential that, if integrated incrementally, could extend Lu Chen's sensory network across entire mountain sectors, yet subtle hormonal fluctuations following the basin battle indicated increasing predatory impulse correlating with hierarchical absorption, prompting him to institute stricter psychological regulation protocols including sensory deprivation intervals and cognitive anchoring routines to preserve clarity. During one such isolation cycle he detected a faint but distinct resonance echo far beyond previous southwestern vectors, originating instead from northern highlands where seismic activity suggested large-scale structural collapse unrelated to natural causes, and cross-referencing Zhao's scout reports confirmed abnormal horde density migrating from that region in disciplined waves rather than scattered drift. This implied the existence of another apex entity beyond his current sphere, potentially stronger or at least equal in developmental stage, and the strategic question shifted from territorial defense to preemptive reconnaissance before northern convergence encroached upon stabilized zones. After calculated deliberation he selected mobility over stagnation, preparing a forward operating cache network along mountain passes while reinforcing bunker automation to sustain itself in his absence, understanding that survival now required expanding influence outward rather than fortifying inward, because in an ecosystem of evolving predators, isolation eventually yielded vulnerability no matter how reinforced the walls. Chapter 19 Departure occurred at dawn under low-cloud cover as Lu Chen sealed the bunker's primary hatch and activated autonomous defense routines calibrated to repel minor incursions without revealing structural depth, then advanced northward across rugged terrain with efficiency born of mutation-enhanced endurance, covering distances in hours that once required days while mapping seismic irregularities in real time. Along the third mountain pass he encountered evidence of coordinated slaughter. Infected corpses bisected cleanly, skulls crushed with force exceeding known variant metrics, yet no consumption patterns present, signaling conflict between apex entities rather than predator feeding. The residual resonance in the air felt sharper, colder than Prime's domain, lacking territorial assertion and instead radiating expansionist pressure. And as night fell he ascended a cliffside overlook to observe a valley below where hundreds of infected moved in disciplined procession toward a central elevation crowned by a fractured transmission tower. Atop that structure stood a distant figure whose silhouette appeared leaner than Prime yet emanated a pulse that vibrated even across kilometers, drawing subordinates inward like iron filings to magnet, and in that moment Lu Chen recognized the evolutionary ladder extended far beyond regional dominance, presenting not isolated rivals but an ascending chain of apex nodes shaping the plague's trajectory across provinces. Chapter 20 Rather than descend immediately into confrontation, Lu Chen withdrew to concealed altitude and initiated prolonged observation, tracking precession intervals and subordinate density fluctuations while recording subtle variations in the northern apex's command gestures, which differed from Prime's territorial control by exhibiting outward signaling patterns as if broadcasting beyond immediate valley bounds. This discovery suggested a proto-network linking apex entities across vast distances, potentially coordinating migration or conflict in response to shifts in dominance such as Prime's death, and if so, his own existence might already be registered within that network as disruptive variable. Strategic calculus therefore shifted from simple elimination toward targeted destabilization of communication pathways, and he began experimenting with portable resonance emitters tuned not to disrupt subordinates but to scramble apex-level signaling.
testing low-intensity pulses.
Against peripheral infected to gauge response latency, preliminary results indicated temporary disorientation within controlled radii, validating feasibility yet demanding proximity to achieve meaningful interference, and as he calibrated devices beneath starlit silence, Lu Chen accepted that the next phase of survival would not hinge solely on strength but on mastering the invisible frequencies binding this new order together, because only by severing those connections could he prevent
coordinated escalation capable of overwhelming even his evolved capabilities.
Chapter 21. At dawn, Lu Chen advanced along the valley's western escarpment, keeping elevation advantage while deploying micro-resonance beacons at staggered intervals designed to triangulate and distort the northern apex's broadcast pattern, each device anchored beneath rock overhangs to avoid immediate detection, and as the sun rose he activated the first sequence, releasing calibrated interference that rippled invisibly through the basin. The effect manifested gradually as subordinate infected faltered in synchronized movement, their procession stuttering into uneven clusters while the lean apex atop the transmission tower tilted its head sharply, posture shifting from expansionist poise to investigative tension, confirming that its authority relied upon stable signal projection. Escalating output across additional beacons, Lu Chen observed measurable fragmentation within outer horde rings, creating exploitable gaps in defensive density, yet he restrained the urge to capitalize prematurely, prioritizing cumulative destabilization rather than impulsive assault, because unlike Prime, this entity exhibited broader communication range that could summon reinforcements from beyond visible perimeter. Through optical magnification he studied its morphology, elongated limbs optimized for speed rather than brute force, cranial ridge narrower yet extending backward in fin-like structure that likely enhanced signal emission, and concluded that direct confrontation without prior attenuation would risk overwhelming coordinated counterstrike. Thus he continued pulse modulation throughout daylight hours, mapping response thresholds and identifying moments where the apex's control faltered fractionally longer than baseline. Each second of instability logged his future strike window, and by nightfall he possessed a developing blueprint not merely to fight this predator,
but to sever its influence before delivering the decisive blow.
Chapter 22. The northern apex retaliated sooner than projected, abandoning static command posture and descending from the fractured tower with alarming velocity, its movements fluid and deliberate as it navigated rocky terrain directly toward the western escarpment where interference signals originated, suggesting rapid triangulation capability that narrowed Lu Chen's margin for stealth. Anticipating this response, he deactivated two outer beacons and triggered a controlled landslide along a secondary ridge to misdirect approach vectors, sending debris cascading into the valley and drawing a portion of subordinate infected away from the apex's flank. Nevertheless, the lean predator altered course mid-stride, bypassing distraction and accelerating uphill with single-minded precision that confirmed adaptive intelligence surpassing Prime's territorial focus. Recognizing imminent engagement,
Lu Chen repositioned to a narrow saddle between cliff faces seated with resonance amplifiers
tuned to overload emission receptors at close range, and as the apex breached the saddle's entrance he activated the array, unleashing concentrated interference that distorted the air with palpable vibration. The creature recoiled, movements momentarily desynchronized, and Lu Chen exploited the disruption to launch a high-velocity projectile aimed at the cranial fin structure hypothesized as signal conduit, the impact shearing partial plating and eliciting a shriek that reverberated across the valley, fracturing subordinate cohesion below. Yet despite injury the apex did not retreat but instead fixed upon him with predatory focus sharpened by pain, and in that locked gaze Lu Chen understood that this battle would escalate beyond calculated attrition into a contest of adaptation under relentless pressure. Chapter 23. The clash unfolded across the saddle in bursts of speed that shattered stone beneath their feet, the northern apex favoring rapid feints and angular lunges designed to exploit terrain elevation, while Lu Chen countered with predictive sidesteps and targeted strikes aimed at previously damaged cranial ridging, each exchange compressing into microseconds where survival hinged on anticipation rather than strength. The creature's claws sliced through reinforced plating during one near miss, grazing his shoulder and sending a surge of destabilizing resonance through his nervous system that momentarily blurred sensory clarity, revealing that its offensive capacity extended beyond physical trauma into frequency-based disruption capable of scrambling his augmented perception. Forcing himself into cognitive anchor routines mid-combat, he recalibrated internal pulse alignment to counter interference, stabilizing neural oscillation enough to regain predictive advantage, then maneuvered deliberately toward the saddle's narrowest choke where amplifiers remained active. Timing his advance between the apex's rapid strikes, he triggered maximum output from the array at point-blank range, overwhelming the creature's emission structure and causing violent convulsions that fractured its coordinated motor control. And in that fleeting collapse of symmetry he drove his spear upward through the exposed cranial fin into neural core, twisting with amplified force until resistance gave way, the apex spasmed, claws raking sparks from rock before its frame slackened and slid across stone, and as its broadcast ceased the valley below dissolved into chaotic disarray, subordinate infected scattering without unifying directive, while Lu Chen stood amid echoing silence aware that he had severed another node within a widening evolutionary web. Chapter 24 Absorption of the northern apex's neural tissue proved more volatile than Prime's integration, its emission structures still thrumming with residual frequency that clashed against his stabilized internal rhythm, and upon introducing a refined extract into controlled bloodstream channels he experienced immediate cognitive expansion accompanied by intrusive signal bleed, fragmentary impressions of distant movement patterns, faint directional pulls that suggested other apex presences. Registering the sudden void left by their fallen counterpart, unlike previous evolutions, this integration did not merely enhance strength or speed but extended his perceptual horizon outward in concentric rings measured across dozens of kilometers, allowing him to detect dense mutation clusters as pressure anomalies within mental space. Though maintaining clarity required continuous modulation to prevent sensory overload, he isolated himself within a temporary mountain shelter for 2 days, practicing resonance alignment until foreign pulses harmonized rather than conflicted, gradually converting chaotic influx into structured awareness, and when stabilization finalized he could map apex-level disturbances across provincial boundaries with unsettling precision, effectively transforming himself into mobile counternode within the plague's hierarchy. The cost manifested as deeper emotional detachment and intensified predatory impulse, yet disciplined anchoring preserved executive control, and as he descended once more toward Sichuan territory he recognized that the battlefield had expanded beyond physical geography into invisible networks of dominance where each fallen apex strengthened his reach while simultaneously alerting more distant rivals to the emergence of a consolidating force. Chapter 25 Returning south, Lu Chen detected immediate shifts within previously stabilized zones, minor variant clusters dissolving without Prime's residual influence while scattered resonance flickers pulsed intermittently along eastern plains, indicating additional apex entities maneuvering in response to northern collapse, and he concluded that prolonged regional defense would only invite convergence from multiple fronts seeking to test or eliminate the consolidating anomaly he had become. Strategic doctrine therefore pivoted from reactive elimination to proactive suppression, targeting nascent apex signatures before full maturation could occur, and he established a rotating campaign model: identify, destabilize communication pathways, eliminate command structure, integrate selectively while monitoring cumulative strain, balancing growth against psychological erosion. Captain Zhao's unit, now seasoned and mobile, received encrypted advisories guiding them away from projected conflict corridors while providing safe transit routes between dwindling survivor enclaves, indirectly shaping human migration patterns to avoid apex convergence zones. Standing once more upon a ridge overlooking the Sichuan hills where his bunker lay concealed beneath quiet farmland, Lu Chen felt the steady, layered pulse of absorbed hierarchies resonating within his veins, not as chaotic hunger but as structured network under his control, and he understood that revenge against Wei Dong had been only the beginning. True survival in this transformed world required dismantling the plague's emerging order node by node until no apex remained beyond his awareness, and only then could humanity carve space to endure beneath a sky no longer ruled by unseen predators. Chapter 26 With 2 apex nodes absorbed, Lu Chen's perceptual field now stretched like an invisible web across multiple mountain corridors, and within that expanding awareness he identified a faint but accelerating resonance east of the Yangtze tributaries, weaker than Prime or the northern emitter yet growing at exponential rate, suggesting a nascent apex in early consolidation phase. Unlike mature entities that commanded disciplined hordes, this signature fluctuated erratically, pulsing in unstable bursts that triggered chaotic surges among surrounding infected, a pattern consistent with mutation overload rather than refined control, and Lu Chen recognized both opportunity and danger in such volatility, because early elimination would prevent full network integration while delayed action risked explosive maturation. He secured his Sichuan bunker under autonomous protocol once more and moved eastward with increased efficiency born of layered evolution, crossing fractured highways and abandoned villages where silence felt temporary rather than absolute, and along the third night of travel he encountered evidence of violent territorial conflict, trees splintered by blunt force, asphalt cratered by impact, and dozens of infected torn apart without consumption, indicating that the emerging apex possessed brute strength disproportionate to its signal clarity. Observing from elevated terrain, he located the source within a collapsed industrial park where a massive, asymmetrical figure rampaged unpredictably through its own subordinates, crushing skulls and scattering bodies as if incapable of regulating its dominance output, and Lu Chen concluded that this entity represented a transitional stage between chaos and hierarchy, a volatile crucible that could either collapse inward or ignite into something far more destructive if left unchecked. Chapter 27. Rather than initiate immediate confrontation, Lu Chen implemented a containment strategy designed to accelerate the unstable apex's self-destruction, deploying low-intensity resonance distorters around the industrial perimeter to amplify its already erratic broadcast patterns, intentionally overstimulating subordinate response loops until coordination devolved into infighting. And over the course of 12 hours he observed escalating disorder as infected clusters turned upon one another in spasmodic aggression triggered by conflicting command pulses. The massive apex responded with violent sweeps that obliterated dozens at a time, yet each exertion further destabilized its signal coherence, creating feedback surges that reverberated outward in dissonant waves perceptible even within his reinforced auditory range.
Calculating the threshold at which internal collapse would weaken structural defenses sufficiently, Lu Chen infiltrated the industrial complex under cover of
smoke from ignited fuel reserves, navigating through corridors littered with twitching bodies while maintaining precise modulation of his own resonance to avoid triggering direct lock-on. When he finally confronted the unstable giant within a warehouse shell, it lashed out indiscriminately rather than strategically, its movements powerful but inefficient, and he exploited this lack of refinement by targeting joint nodes and cranial sutures with disciplined strikes, conserving energy while the apex exhausted itself in chaotic bursts. The final blow came not through brute force but through induced overload, as he synchronized his internal pulse against its fluctuating emission and forced resonance collision that shattered neural coherence from within, collapsing the creature amid a storm of convulsions that silenced the industrial park in abrupt stillness. Chapter 28. Integration of the unstable apex's core required extreme caution, its neural lattice fragmented and scarred by self-inflicted feedback loops, and Lu Chen dissected the tissue meticulously within a temporary shelter, isolating intact filaments while discarding corrupted segments to prevent cognitive contamination. Because unlike previous absorptions, this entity offered raw amplification without structural discipline. Upon introducing purified extracts in fractional doses, he experienced a surge not of clarity but of kinetic potential, muscles tightening with explosive elasticity while reflex arcs shortened further, enabling near-instant directional shifts that redefined his combat mobility. However, accompanying this enhancement emerged intrusive flashes, brief, violent impulses devoid of strategic framing, residual echoes of the unstable apex's chaotic dominance pattern,
and he countered them through prolonged sensory isolation until foreign noise diminished beneath
his anchored identity. When stabilization completed, he conducted live field trials against migrating infected columns, moving through them with controlled velocity that rendered his presence a blur of decisive strikes, eliminating dozens before residual bodies registered his passage, and he acknowledged that while hierarchical awareness governed the macro battlefield, refined mobility governed micro engagements. Standing atop the industrial complex at dusk, he scanned eastward horizons and detected multiple faint resonance flickers reacting subtly to the recent node collapse, confirming that each elimination altered the broader network's equilibrium, and that his campaign was reshaping not only territory but the evolutionary trajectory of the plague itself. Chapter 29. Captain Zhao's unit, now operating as mobile scouts between survivor enclaves, transmitted encrypted intelligence regarding rumors of coordinated infected migrations near a river delta far south, movements too synchronized to be random yet lacking visible apex silhouette, prompting Lu Chen to analyze resonance data from extended range and identify a diffuse but wide-spectrum broadcast unlike any prior node, less concentrated yet spanning greater horizontal distance. This pattern suggested an alternative evolutionary pathway, distributed command through multiple semi-linked variants rather than single dominant apex, and the implications unsettled even his disciplined calculus, because dismantling such a network would require sequential precision rather than singular decapitation. He relayed navigational advisories to Zhao to avoid southern corridors and pivoted his own trajectory accordingly, traversing mountain passes toward the delta region while monitoring signal fluctuations that intensified as he approached coastal humidity zones. Upon reaching elevated observation above the river plain, he witnessed infected clusters moving in lattice formations, smaller variants positioned at interval points like relay towers transmitting coordinated pulses across the landscape, forming a web that funneled civilian stragglers toward central kill zones without centralized visible commander.
Lu Chen recognized that the plague's evolution was diversifying beyond
singular apex dominance, and that survival would demand adaptation not only against stronger predators but against smarter systems capable of redundancy and decentralized resilience. Chapter 30 Confronting the distributed network required surgical dismantling of relay variants without alerting adjacent nodes, and Lu Chen devised a phased infiltration plan targeting peripheral transmitters first, exploiting his expanded perceptual range to identify the weakest signal junctions where coordination lagged fractionally behind core rhythm. Under nocturnal cover, he eliminated the outermost relay with silent precision, crushing its cranial emitter before it could broadcast alarm, and immediately suppressed resultant signal vacuum by modulating his own resonance to mimic residual output temporarily, preventing neighboring nodes from detecting abrupt absence. This delicate impersonation allowed him to approach successive relays sequentially, repeating the process across hours of meticulous advancement until lattice coherence degraded into patchwork instability, and as synchronization faltered, infected clusters drifted from formation into aimless wandering susceptible to environmental traps Zhao's distant scouts could manage without direct exposure. By dawn, only the central transmitter remained active near the riverbank, its signal now amplified in strain as it attempted to compensate for lost connections, and Lu Chen prepared for final engagement, aware that dismantling a distributed system required precision beyond brute elimination. Standing at the edge of marshland with mist rising over stagnant water, he felt the layered pulses within his veins align into disciplined cadence, not chaotic hunger but structured intent, and stepped forward to sever yet another evolutionary branch before it matured into a threat capable of overwhelming even his carefully forged dominion. Chapter 31 The marsh swallowed sound as Lu Chen advanced toward the central transmitter, mud sucking softly at his boots while mist diffused visibility into shifting silhouettes, yet his expanded perception traced the emitter's pulse with unwavering clarity, guiding him through reed clusters until he glimpsed the relay core perched atop a half-submerged ferry hull lodged against the riverbank. Unlike previous apex forms, this node was lean and symmetrical, cranial ridges branching laterally like antenna arrays that shimmered faintly with bioelectric discharge, broadcasting layered signals that attempted to re-establish lost lattice connections. Sensing interference within its network, it rotated slowly, scanning in deliberate arcs rather than lunging blindly, confirming higher computational adaptation than brute variance. Lu Chen synchronized his internal resonance to mimic residual relay output once more, masking his approach until he reached striking distance along the tilted deck. Then abruptly severed mimicry and unleashed a concentrated disruptor pulse calibrated to overload antenna structures, causing visible fractures to ripple along the ridges as the node convulsed in reactive distortion. Before it could recalibrate, he closed distance with explosive acceleration enhanced by unstable apex integration, delivering successive precision strikes that shattered cranial emitters one by one, each break reducing broadcast amplitude until only erratic sparks flickered across its skull. The final thrust penetrated the neural core beneath layered plating, and as the transmitter collapsed into the marsh, the surrounding infected across the delta drifted into disarray, their coordinated lattice dissolving like severed circuitry, leaving only scattered threats rather than systemic trap. Chapter 32 Elimination of the distributed core triggered a cascading silence unlike previous apex deaths, not a sharp pulse but a gradual fading across kilometers as subordinate nodes attempted briefly to compensate before collapsing into inert autonomy, and Lu Chen remained within the marsh until resonance fields stabilized, ensuring no hidden redundancy remained to reignite coordination. Harvesting tissue from the transmitter revealed structural specialization rather than hierarchical dominance, its neural lattice optimized for signal amplification across breadth rather than strength concentration, and he extracted only minimal viable filaments to study potential range extension while discarding bulk mass that offered little direct enhancement. Integration of these fragments subtly widened his perceptual horizon laterally, allowing finer resolution of distant weak signatures without significantly increasing internal strain, a refinement rather than escalation, and he recognized that diversification of absorbed traits must remain selective to prevent cognitive overload. As dawn illuminated the river plain, he surveyed scattered infected wandering without direction, aware that Zhao's unit and other survivors could now traverse delta routes with reduced systemic threat, and transmitted encoded advisories indicating temporary corridor stabilization. Yet within his broadened awareness, faint tremors stirred far beyond provincial boundaries, deeper inland where mountainous terrain concealed signals stronger than any encountered thus far, layered and overlapping in complex harmonics that implied coexistence rather than singular rule. And Lu Chen understood that while he had dismantled regional networks, the true crucible of evolution might lie at the convergence of multiple apex entities cohabiting rather than competing. Chapter 33 Traveling inland toward the mountainous convergence zone, Lucian adopted heightened caution, minimizing active resonance output to avoid premature detection by the layered signatures ahead, and along abandoned expressways he observed increasing frequency of high-level variant carcasses bearing signs of mutual combat rather than human intervention, suggesting territorial skirmishes among Apex-class entities vying for dominance, upon reaching a vantage overlooking a canyon settlement. Reduced to skeletal concrete frames, he detected 3 distinct pulses operating in overlapping radius yet not fully merging, each maintaining defined territory boundaries within the canyon sectors as if engaged in cold equilibrium rather than open war. Through extended surveillance he identified morphological differences among them, one heavily armored with dense plating occupying industrial ruins, another agile and elongated controlling elevated residential tiers, and a third partially concealed within subterranean subway tunnels emitting lower frequency but persistent command waves. This triad configuration represented an unprecedented complexity where balance of power prevented singular expansion, and Lucian recognized opportunity within stalemate, because destabilizing one node might provoke conflict that weakened the remaining pair without direct confrontation. He mapped patrol routes and broadcast intervals meticulously, calculating which apex exhibited most aggressive expansion signals, concluding that the armored industrial dominator sought incremental encroachment beyond its sector, and thus selecting it as initial target whose removal could ignite recalibration among the canyon hierarchy. Chapter 34 Initiating disruption required precision beyond previous campaigns, for premature exposure to multiple apex signals could result in encirclement, and Lucian deployed microdisruptors along the industrial perimeter tuned narrowly to the armored dominator's frequency band, avoiding spillover interference that might alert the other 2 entities. Over successive nights he degraded its outer control rings, causing subordinate infected within the factory district to respond sluggishly or misinterpret commands, subtly weakening territorial grip without triggering overt aggression from rival sectors. When signal instability reached threshold, the elongated residential apex detected encroachment opportunity and probed boundary lines with exploratory surges, testing for weakness, exactly as Lucian anticipated. At that calculated moment he infiltrated the factory complex and confronted the armored dominator within a cavernous assembly hall, where molten metal vats once stood silent, and engaged in brutal close-quarters combat against plating thicker than primes, requiring repeated high-velocity impacts to fracture joint seams while evading crushing blows capable of pulverizing reinforced pillars. Exploiting prior signal degradation, he synchronized a resonance spike during a lateral feint, overloading the dominator's coordination circuits at critical instant before driving a hardened blade through exposed ocular cavity into neural nexus, twisting until armored mass collapsed amid echoing clang of metal. Retreating immediately, he withdrew to canyon rim as expected power vacuum triggered aggressive surge from the elongated apex toward former industrial territory, initiating conflict that would redraw canyon equilibrium without direct entanglement of his own position. Chapter 35 From elevated concealment Lucian observed the canyon descend into calculated chaos as the elongated apex advanced rapidly through factory ruins, clashing with residual loyalist variants of the fallen armored dominator. While the subterranean tunnel entity remained initially passive, its low-frequency emissions steady and observant rather than reactive. As territorial lines shifted and industrial districts succumbed to new control, the elongated apex's signal amplitude spiked in triumph, yet the tunnel entity responded not with retreat but with gradual escalation of broadcast strength that seeped upward through fissures and storm drains, infiltrating both rival sectors simultaneously. Lucian sensed the emerging dynamic immediately, a silent predator exploiting open conflict to extend influence beneath notice, and recognized that unlike overtly expansionist nodes, the subterranean entity favored patience and infiltration, a strategy potentially more dangerous than brute dominance. Recalibrating his approach, he shifted focus toward mapping underground passages and signal conduits that radiated from subway tunnels into adjacent districts, preparing for a confrontation that would likely unfold in confined spaces where resonance amplification behaved unpredictably. As night deepened and canyon fires flickered across broken skyline, he acknowledged that each region presented unique evolutionary archetypes: armor, agility, distribution, infiltration, and that his own survival depended upon mastering countermeasures against every variation before they coalesced into alliances capable of challenging his accumulated dominion. Chapter 36 Lucian entered the canyon subway system through a collapsed ventilation shaft at the perimeter, descending into stale darkness where moisture dripped steadily from fractured concrete and the air carried a dense, metallic undertone of layered mutation, and immediately he dampened his outward resonance to minimal emission, aware that confined tunnels could amplify detection if misaligned. Unlike surface apex domains defined by overt patrols,
the subterranean network revealed subtle
orchestration. Infected positioned at junction points without wandering, their stillness deliberate rather than inert, forming living relay stations along tunnel arteries. Advancing silently, he mapped the entity's broadcast gradient and identified a central hub beneath the main station platform where low-frequency pulses radiated upward through structural pillars into the canyon above, a strategy optimized for gradual infiltration rather than dramatic conquest. As he approached the platform edge, the air vibrated faintly and tunnel guardians shifted simultaneously, indicating partial detection despite his modulation, and moments later the subterranean apex emerged from shadowed rail tracks, its form less imposing in mass yet unnervingly adaptive, limbs elongated for crawling along walls and ceiling, cranial ridge recessed but encircled by oscillating filaments that pulsed in slow, deliberate rhythm. It did not charge recklessly but retreated deeper into the station, drawing him inward past multiple branching corridors, an invitation or trap impossible to distinguish, and Luchun understood that this battle would test not brute strength but control within confined resonance chambers where every miscalculated pulse could rebound unpredictably against stone and steel. Chapter 37. Inside the station's cavernous concourse, the subterranean apex halted beneath fractured skylights that allowed thin shafts of moonlight to pierce the gloom, and instead of initiating direct assault it amplified its low-frequency broadcast, causing tunnel guardians along walls and escalators to converge in synchronized arcs designed to limit Luchun's mobility. Recognizing encirclement pattern, he deployed compact disruptors at cardinal points across the concourse floor, establishing a counterfield that fragmented subordinate cohesion while preserving his central position, then advanced toward the apex with controlled aggression to prevent prolonged signal escalation. The entity responded with startling agility, scuttling along vertical pillars and ceiling beams, striking from oblique angles that exploited acoustics and blind spots, its attacks accompanied by resonance bursts aimed at destabilizing his equilibrium within the echoing chamber. Each collision reverberated violently through the station, steel railings bending under impact as Luchun adjusted internal pulse alignment repeatedly to avoid cognitive interference, and gradually he discerned that the apex's strength lay not in raw power but in its ability to manipulate environmental acoustics, using architectural curvature to amplify its broadcasts. Shifting tactics, he triggered a high-frequency spike at maximum output precisely as the creature leapt between beams, causing resonance reflection from tiled surfaces that fed back into its own emission filaments, and in that disoriented instant he propelled himself upward, seizing a structural cable to vault midair and drive a reinforced blade downward through the apex's recessed cranial ridge, anchoring it to the concourse floor where successive strikes shattered neural coherence beyond recovery. Chapter 38. Silence returned gradually to the subway system as Guardian-infected lost synchronized positioning and drifted into erratic wandering. Their infiltration pattern dissolved at its core, and Luchun remained kneeling beside the fallen subterranean apex while monitoring for residual broadcast spikes that might indicate hidden redundancies deeper within the tunnel lattice, confirming signal extinction. He extracted select neural filaments characterized by adaptive modulation capacity rather than sheer output strength, recognizing that this entity's greatest asset had been environmental manipulation rather than dominance. Amplitude integration required careful calibration, for subterranean resonance patterns operated at lower frequencies that risked dampening his higher band detection range if improperly harmonized. Yet through deliberate incremental infusion he succeeded in layering adaptive modulation atop existing hierarchy without destabilizing structural coherence. The result manifested not as expanded range but as refined stealth capacity, enabling him to compress or diffuse his resonance signature dynamically according to terrain acoustics, effectively granting camouflage within complex environments. Ascending from the subway before dawn, he surveyed the canyon where elongated residential apex now consolidated industrial territory, unaware that the infiltrator beneath had vanished, and Luchun recognized strategic opportunity to eliminate the final canyon node before it matured unchallenged, because fragmented hierarchies inevitably reconverged if left unattended, and each unchecked apex represented potential alliance within a growing web extending beyond provincial borders. Chapter 39. The elongated apex occupied high-rise skeletal frames overlooking the canyon, its agile frame navigating vertical surfaces with predatory grace while subordinate infected patrolled rooftops and stairwells in layered defensive rings, and Luchun approached via abandoned construction cranes that provided elevated pathways beyond typical ground surveillance. Utilizing newly integrated modulation ability, he minimized resonance leakage to avoid early detection while deploying micro disruptors along rooftop perimeters to fracture coordination before direct engagement. As predicted, signal interference triggered subtle confusion among outer patrols, creating exploitable gaps that allowed him to traverse building facades unnoticed until he reached the Apex's central perch atop a collapsed penthouse floor. The entity reacted with swift precision once proximity threshold breached, launching into high-velocity assaults that prioritized evasion and flanking maneuvers. Yet, without support from a stabilized canyon hierarchy, its commands lacked depth resilience, and Lu Chen exploited this vulnerability by drawing the fight across structurally weakened beams he had pre-identified during surveillance. At a calculated moment, he shattered support joints beneath the Apex mid-leap, sending both crashing through multiple levels where falling debris disrupted its balance more than his own, and before it could recover footing, he engaged in decisive close-quarters exchange, driving successive strikes into cranial plating already stressed by earlier resonance interference until neural core collapsed under compounded trauma, leaving the canyon devoid of Apex governance entirely. Chapter 40. With the canyon triad dismantled, a rare phenomenon unfolded across his expanded perceptual field. Overlapping pulses that had once competed now faded into dispersed static, creating a temporary vacuum across multiple mountain corridors, and Lu Chen felt the accumulated weight of absorbed hierarchies settle into stable cadence within his veins, stronger yet more controlled than at any previous stage. Unlike earlier integrations that surged unpredictably, this consolidation harmonized diverse traits: territorial dominance, distributed signaling awareness, kinetic explosiveness, and environmental modulation into coherent architecture governed by disciplined intent. Standing atop the canyon rim as dawn illuminated fractured cityscape below, he extended his perception outward and confirmed absence of immediate rival nodes within significant radius, though distant faint signatures persisted beyond mountain ranges hinting at larger convergence zones still untouched. Captain Zhao's scouts soon reported safer transit through once hostile sectors, evidence that his unseen campaign reshaped human survival corridors without overt acknowledgement. Yet Lu Chen remained detached from gratitude or recognition, focused instead on long-term equilibrium where unchecked apex growth anywhere could cascade toward his domain. As winds swept through ruined towers, he acknowledged that the evolutionary war had shifted from regional skirmishes to continental scale, and while he now stood unchallenged across vast territory, he understood that consolidation invited counterbalance from farther horizons, and the path forward would demand vigilance equal to power if humanity was to endure beneath skies no longer ruled by organized mutation. Chapter 41. For the first time since his rebirth, Lu Chen allowed himself a full day without immediate pursuit, retreating to a concealed mountain outpost to recalibrate his internal resonance after successive absorptions, and within controlled stillness he extended perception outward in widening arcs that brushed against distant provincial borders, mapping faint apex signatures flickering like dying embers far beyond the canyon's quiet. The network felt thinner here, less structured than before. Yet subtle tremors from the northeast suggested a mass migration event rather than singular node expansion, and cross-referencing Zhao's encrypted field reports confirmed entire infected columns moving in broad seasonal-like shifts along rail corridors as if drawn toward a convergence unseen. Analyzing harmonic patterns within those pulses, Lu Chen identified a deeper undertone beneath them all, a foundational frequency older and steadier than the apexes he had eliminated, one that did not dominate directly but seemed to anchor their existence like gravitational baseline. The implication unsettled even his disciplined calculus, because dismantling regional nodes might only prune branches while the trunk remained intact somewhere beyond his current range. He documented the undertone's spectral characteristics and began triangulation projections, determining that its origin likely lay far inland across heavily forested mountain chains where pre-outbreak population density had been sparse, and as twilight settled over the ridge he acknowledged that the war against apex entities had evolved into a search for the source frequency itself, the root from which hierarchies sprouted and toward which migrations subtly bent. Chapter 42. Travel northeast required crossing fractured provinces where infrastructure lay collapsed and scattered survivor enclaves clung to defensive strongholds, and Lu Chen moved swiftly yet discreetly, avoiding unnecessary elimination to preserve energy while tracking the deep undertone that pulsed faintly through his perception like distant thunder beneath the earth. Along an abandoned rail junction he encountered evidence of coordinated apex passage, tracks bent inward, freight cars overturned with deliberate clearance rather than chaotic destruction, yet no active node remained, suggesting transit rather than settlement, and the undertone strengthened incrementally with each kilometer advanced. During one nocturnal traverse he detected simultaneous micropulses from three separate ridgelines, not independent apex signatures but synchronized echoes responding to the same distant anchor, confirming hierarchical layering where subordinate nodes oriented toward central source. Rather than engage these minor echoes, he allowed them to persist as directional markers guiding his approach, conserving strength for confrontation with the origin. Zhao transmitted cautious inquiry regarding expanding migration patterns, and Lu Chen replied only with advisories to shift human movement westward temporarily, withholding full explanation to prevent panic.
As mountains thickened into dense forest and air cooled with elevation, the foundational frequency intensified into palpable
vibration beneath his skin, no longer faint but steady and immense, and he understood that he was approaching not merely another apex, but the stabilizing constant that allowed all others to rise. Chapter 43. From a high plateau overlooking a vast forest basin, Lu Chen finally perceived the source zone, a region where wildlife had vanished and vegetation appeared trampled into concentric clearings radiating from a central depression too symmetrical to be natural, and within his expanded resonance field the undertone resolved into layered harmonics beyond anything previously encountered, steady, patient, immeasurably deep. Unlike aggressive apex pulses that flared and shifted, this signal remained constant as bedrock, neither expanding nor retreating, simply existing with quiet authority that shaped surrounding migrations without visible exertion. He observed peripheral minor apex entities orbiting the basin at respectful distance, none daring to encroach fully, their pulses aligning subconsciously to the deeper rhythm. And Lu Chen realized he faced a phenomenon different from hierarchical dominance, a progenitor node or evolutionary anchor whose presence stabilized the entire regional network. Direct assault without understanding risked catastrophic backlash across provinces, yet delay could allow further maturation of subordinate apexes nourished by its constant broadcast. Establishing a concealed observation post along the plateau, he initiated prolonged surveillance to decode emission patterns, measuring amplitude variance across time intervals and correlating them with distant migration shifts, and over successive nights he confirmed that the undertone subtly intensified during lunar cycles, suggesting environmental coupling that magnified its reach. As realization settled, he acknowledged that defeating this anchor would not resemble prior duels but require dismantling an ecosystem balanced around its frequency. Chapter 44. Lu Chen descended cautiously into the forest basin's outer ring under heavy canopy, modulating his resonance to near silence while deploying microsensors across radial clearings to analyze ground vibration and signal propagation pathways, and within hours he identified a subterranean cavern network beneath the central depression where harmonic amplitude peaked dramatically, implying the anchor resided below ground rather than upon it. Infected within outer rings displayed minimal aggression, standing almost dormant yet aligned toward the basin core as if sustained rather than commanded, and this passive synchronization indicated that the anchor did not rely on overt control but provided baseline coherence, enabling other apex entities to amplify themselves elsewhere. Recognizing that abrupt elimination could trigger widespread network collapse with unpredictable mutation backlash, Lu Chen devised phased destabilization aimed at gradually attenuating harmonic strength. Before direct engagement, installing deep ground resonance dampeners at strategic nodes along cavern periphery to siphon and diffuse output over time. Activation of the first dampener caused subtle tremor beneath his feet and a slight dip in undertone intensity perceptible only through his enhanced awareness, yet no immediate retaliatory surge followed, confirming that the anchor's response latency differed from typical apex behavior. As dusk settled over the basin and distant minor nodes flickered in mild confusion, he prepared additional dampeners, understanding that patience and precision would determine whether this confrontation reshaped the continent's mutation hierarchy or unleashed consequences beyond calculation. Chapter 45. By the fourth dampener activation, the forest basin's undertone wavered for the first time, a minute fluctuation within its once immutable cadence, and distant minor apex pulses faltered in near unison as if deprived of stabilizing current, causing scattered territorial clashes across mountain corridors that rippled faintly through Lu Chen's perception. The anchor, however, did not erupt in defensive aggression but responded with incremental harmonic adjustment, attempting to compensate for siphoned energy by deepening its frequency range rather than amplifying amplitude, an adaptive maneuver that confirmed advanced evolutionary refinement beyond surface predators. Interpreting this as invitation to accelerate, Lu Chen positioned final dampeners in tighter radius near cavern entrance and prepared descent into the subterranean chamber, aware that diminishing baseline stability could either weaken the anchor sufficiently for surgical elimination or drive it into reactive state that would broadcast across provinces in destabilizing surge. As he stepped into the cavern's cool darkness, bioluminescent fungal growth illuminated vast stone columns surrounding a central organic mass fused partially with bedrock, its structure less humanoid than prior apexes and more akin to a neural root system embedded within Earth itself, pulsing with immense yet controlled rhythm. Standing before the anchor for the first time, Lu Chen felt neither fear nor rage but Profound recognition that this entity represented origin rather than evolution's branch, and he steadied his breath, preparing to sever the root that nourished the plague's hierarchy across the land. Chapter 46. The cavern trembled faintly as Lu Chen approached the organic mass embedded within bedrock, its surface neither flesh nor stone but a hybrid lattice of calcified tissue interwoven with mineral veins, pulsing in deep, resonant cadence that synchronized subtly with distant echoes across his perceptual field. Unlike prior apexes, the anchor did not possess defined limbs or cranial ridge, yet within its layered folds he detected concentrated neural nodes radiating harmonics outward. Through the cavern walls and into the surrounding forest basin, as he stepped closer, the undertone intensified not in aggression but in awareness, and smaller filaments along the mass began to undulate, adjusting frequency in exploratory pulses that brushed against his own resonance signature. Rather than conceal himself, Lu Chen allowed controlled exposure of his layered cadence, presenting the accumulated hierarchies he had absorbed as structured counterpoint to the anchor's baseline rhythm. For several measured seconds, the cavern filled with overlapping frequencies, his sharp, modulated pulses weaving against the anchor's immense, steady undertone, creating a tension that felt less like imminent combat and more like negotiation conducted through vibration. Then the anchor reacted, not with brute force but by amplifying a low harmonic that penetrated bone and disrupted equilibrium, causing fissures to ripple along the cavern floor and drawing dormant infected from outer rings toward the depression in synchronized march. Recognizing that passive observation had ended, Lu Chen deployed his final dampeners at maximum output, fracturing the harmonic balance within the chamber and initiating the first true clash between mobile apex and rooted origin. Chapter 47. The anchor responded by channeling its immense baseline frequency into focused shockwaves that cascaded through cavern walls, shattering stone pillars and forcing Lu Chen into rapid evasion across unstable terrain as subterranean infected poured down passageways in controlled waves meant to overwhelm through attrition rather than direct duel. Adapting instantly, he modulated his resonance into high-frequency counterbursts that disrupted approaching thralls before they could reach striking range, dismantling wave after wave while advancing steadily toward the central neural lattice. Unlike surface apexes that faltered under direct neural assault, the anchor redistributed damage across its sprawling root system, diffusing impact and maintaining harmonic continuity despite localized strikes, revealing that its strength lay in decentralization embedded within geology itself. Realizing brute penetration would prove inefficient, Lu Chen shifted strategy and synchronized his pulse inversely against the anchor's rhythm, introducing subtle phase shifts that accumulated over successive cycles, gradually desynchronizing harmonic cohesion across the mass. The cavern's glow flickered as fungal light dimmed and peripheral filaments convulsed in irregular patterns, signaling that resonance stability was deteriorating beyond self-correction. Seizing the widening fracture, he propelled himself onto exposed ridges of the mass and drove a resonance spike deep into a concentrated neural node, twisting modulation to amplify internal discord until the anchor's once steady undertone faltered for the first time since he had sensed it across provinces. Chapter 48. The falter reverberated far beyond the cavern, rippling through mountain corridors and forest basins as minor apex pulses destabilized in cascading confusion, and within the chamber the anchor's massive structure convulsed violently, mineral veins cracking under internal strain while deep harmonic oscillations devolved into erratic surges that threatened structural collapse. Yet even in destabilization the entity attempted adaptation, extending thicker root-like tendrils upward to ensnare Lu Chen and absorb his resonance directly. Recognizing him as invasive counternode rather than mere predator, tendrils coiled around his limbs with crushing force, transmitting invasive frequency designed to overwrite his layered hierarchy and fold it into the anchor's baseline network. And for a fraction of a second his perception blurred beneath overwhelming undertone that sought to drown his identity in geological vastness, anchoring fiercely to memory. Beijing's ceiling crack, steel bunker doors, Wei Dong's betrayal. He stabilized internal cadence and inverted absorption attempt, channeling accumulated apex harmonics back through the tendrils in concentrated surge that fractured their coherence and forced the anchor into feedback loop beyond recovery. With final, decisive modulation he unleashed maximum disruptor output directly into the central lattice, shattering neural continuity and collapsing the undertone into chaotic silence as cavern roof split and stone cascaded around him. Escaping through a collapsing side tunnel, Lu Chen emerged onto the forest basin just as the central depression imploded inward, severing the root that had anchored the plague's continental hierarchy. Chapter 49. In the hours following the anchor's destruction, Lu Chen extended his perception cautiously across vast distances and detected unprecedented stillness where layered pulses once thrummed in structured cadence, minor apex signatures flickering uncertainly before dissolving or devolving into erratic, unsustained emissions that lacked stabilizing baseline. without the undertone to nourish or align them.
Surviving apex entities across provinces entered open conflict or collapsed into
localized predators incapable of continental coordination, fracturing the evolutionary web into isolated strands rather than unified lattice. Zhao's scouts soon reported dramatic reduction in synchronized migrations, with infected reverting to scattered roaming patterns reminiscent of early outbreak chaos, dangerous yet no longer guided by invisible hierarchy. Within himself,
Lu Chen felt immense harmonic space where the anchor's deep frequency had once pressed against his perception, replaced
now by quieter equilibrium shaped solely by accumulated nodes he consciously governed. However, the victory carried subtle cost: removal of baseline stability, increased unpredictability among residual mutations, and isolated apex remnants might evolve along divergent paths no longer constrained by continental rhythm. Standing at the basin's rim overlooking smoldering collapse below, he acknowledged that he had not eradicated the plague but shattered its organizing principle, transforming structured threat into fragmented wilderness, and survival henceforth would depend not on dismantling grand hierarchies but on constant vigilance against unpredictable mutations rising independently from scattered shadows. Chapter 50. As weeks passed, the mountains remained quiet in a way he had never sensed before. No deep undertone guiding migration, no layered harmonics threading provinces together, only faint sporadic pulses from distant remnants struggling to assert dominance without anchor support. Lu Chen returned gradually toward Sichuan, reactivating his bunker systems and re-establishing observational networks while extending perceptual sweeps outward to ensure no emergent baseline frequency replaced the fallen route. Captain Zhao's unit reported improved survivor stability along transit corridors, enclaves expanding cautiously into reclaimed farmland as organized hordes diminished in scope and coordination, and though infected remained lethal in close quarters, they no longer moved with continental purpose. Standing once more upon the ridge above his concealed farmhouse, Lu Chen felt the layered resonance within his veins settle into calm cadence, powerful yet unchallenged, and for the first time since rebirth he sensed no immediate apex rising to contest his dominion. Revenge against betrayal had begun his path, but it was relentless adaptation that carried him here, to a world no longer ruled by unseen hierarchy but reshaped by his deliberate severing of its root. Gazing across quiet hills where steel doors lay hidden beneath earth, he understood that survival would remain endless discipline. Yet for now humanity possessed space to breathe beneath fractured skies, and he, the solitary counternode forged through betrayal and evolution, stood vigilant not as tyrant of mutation but as its final restraint against resurgence. Chapter 51. Silence did not bring peace, it brought variables, and Lu Chen understood that a shattered hierarchy created ecological vacuum where unpredictable adaptations could gestate beyond structured oversight. So rather than withdraw into isolation he expanded his surveillance grid across Sichuan and neighboring provinces, embedding seismic sensors and passive resonance probes along mountain corridors once dominated by apex nodes. Without the anchor's undertone, residual mutations no longer aligned neatly but spiked sporadically in erratic bursts, some fading within days while others persisted as localized predators competing violently for limited dominance. Zhao's scouts reported sightings of unusually fast lone variants striking villages at night before vanishing into hills, and though their pulses were weak compared to prior apexes, their behavior exhibited cunning unshaped by continental rhythm. Lu Chen tracked one such anomaly through layered terrain and observed it hunting not infected but other minor variants, consuming neural tissue in apparent attempt to self-elevate without external stabilization, a crude echo of his own path yet devoid of discipline. Eliminating it required minimal exertion, yet the encounter clarified a sobering truth: evolution had not ceased, it had decentralized, and countless isolated mutations would now experiment blindly without guiding route. Standing above the valley after dispatching the rogue predator, he acknowledged that his role had shifted from dismantling hierarchy to curating balance, preventing chaotic resurgence before scattered sparks converged into new inferno. Chapter 52. Recognizing the need for proactive containment, Lu Chen initiated a systematic sweep of nearby provinces, targeting mutation clusters exhibiting exponential growth patterns before they matured into structured nodes, and he refined a methodology honed through prior campaigns: identify anomalous resonance spikes, observe behavioral vectors, determine growth trajectory, then intervene with calibrated precision rather than overwhelming force. This measured approach conserved energy while minimizing collateral destabilization across survivor corridors, and Zhao's unit became indirect beneficiaries, receiving coded advisories steering human settlements away from emergent hotspots without revealing the invisible hand orchestrating regional equilibrium. During one such operation in a river gorge, he encountered twin variants evolving cooperatively rather than competitively, sharing minor pulses to enhance ambush efficiency, and their synergy suggested early-stage micro-hierarchy. Independent of the former anchor's influence, dismantling them required isolating one through controlled lure while disrupting the other's signal reception, proving that even decentralized evolution sought structure when advantageous. After neutralization, he integrated minimal adaptive traits while discarding excess mutation, maintaining internal balance through strict filtration protocols. As autumn winds swept across reclaimed farmland, he sensed faint but increasing fluctuations beyond western borders, subtle patterns hinting that other regions might be undergoing similar decentralization crises, and he contemplated whether his campaign would eventually expand beyond national boundaries into a wider struggle reshaping the continent. Chapter 53 Winter descended harsh and early, and with cold came behavioral shifts among infected populations, their metabolic patterns slowing yet clustering in geothermal zones and urban heat pockets, creating dense concentrations ripe for mutation under selective pressure. Luchen monitored these seasonal adaptations carefully, identifying one abandoned thermal plant where residual underground heat sustained a growing congregation exhibiting coordinated dormancy cycles, rotating wake periods. That suggested primitive energy conservation strategy. Infiltrating the facility under snow-muted silence, he discovered a nascent coordinator emerging not through dominance amplitude but through temporal synchronization, a variant whose pulse regulated sleep-wake rhythms among subordinates to optimize survival through winter scarcity. The innovation impressed him with its efficiency,
yet unchecked it could mature into new stabilizing core, so he intervened decisively, dismantling the
coordinator during its active phase and dispersing clustered infected before synchronization solidified. Integration of minor chronoregulation traits enhanced his predictive modeling of mutation cycles, allowing anticipation of seasonal evolutionary spikes across varied climates. Returning to Sichuan's hills as snow-blanketed quiet farmland, he felt neither triumph nor fatigue, only enduring vigilance,
because every adaptation he witnessed confirmed that the plague's capacity for reinvention remained inexhaustible, and only sustained oversight would prevent emergence of another anchor-like convergence in unpredictable form.
Chapter 54 Spring thaw brought migration once more, not continent-spanning columns but fragmented waves flowing unpredictably along river valleys, and Luchen detected a peculiar convergence forming at a hydroelectric dam straddling provincial borders where structural resonance amplified environmental vibrations, inadvertently fostering mutation acceleration within confined spillways.
Ascending the dam's crest, he observed multiple minor variants drawn by echoing acoustics, their pulses
interfering constructively and generating temporary amplification beyond individual capacity, a phenomenon he recognized as harmonic resonance analogous to the former anchor's stabilizing effect yet arising spontaneously from architecture rather than organism. Allowing such convergence to persist risked seeding artificial anchor under favorable conditions, so he sabotaged structural amplifiers within the dam's hollow chambers, installing dampening matrices to absorb and disperse vibrational synergy before eliminating gathered variance in swift succession. As waters roared through spillways, the artificial harmonic field dissipated, scattering infected into isolated wanderers. The event reinforced critical insight: even without biological root, environmental factors could catalyze structured mutation if resonance aligned sufficiently, and safeguarding humanity would require not only hunting predators but understanding landscapes capable of nurturing them. Gazing across the reservoir reflecting clear sky for the first time since outbreak's early days, Luchen acknowledged that the war had evolved into perpetual stewardship of a fragile equilibrium balanced between chaos and convergence. Chapter 55 Months passed with no single apex rising to challenge him, yet Luchen remained alert for anomalies beyond his established range, extending reconnaissance gradually toward coastal regions and inland plains where population density once seeded intense outbreak clusters. During a long-range sweep he detected faint, unfamiliar harmonic signatures beyond national borders to the southwest, pulses layered and distant yet organized, unlike decentralized fragments he had grown accustomed to. Suppressing, analyzing spectral patterns, he concluded these signals did not originate from residual domestic nodes but from separate evolutionary lineage likely shaped by different environmental pressures and urban densities. The realization broadened his strategic horizon immeasurably. Though he had severed one continental route, others might have formed independently elsewhere. Beyond the mountains he now guarded, Zhao's scouts confirmed rumors of refugee caravans. Speaking of coordinated infected territories across distant frontiers, reinforcing his hypothesis that mutation hierarchies had arisen in parallel rather than singular origin. Standing once more above his reinforced farmhouse bunker, steel doors hidden beneath fertile soil slowly reclaimed by spring growth, Luchen felt the layered resonance within his veins steady and controlled, yet his gaze turned toward far horizons where faint pulses flickered like distant storm lightning. Survival had become more than revenge. More than regional dominance, it was an endless frontier against evolving systems wherever they emerged, and he understood that his path would not end within these hills but extend outward as long as mutation dared to organize against humanity's fragile persistence. Chapter 56. Lu Chen did not depart immediately toward the southwestern frontier. Instead, he spent weeks consolidating Sichuan into a monitored sanctuary zone, embedding resonance dampeners along key mountain passes and leaving autonomous disruptor arrays calibrated to suppress sudden mutation spikes in his absence, because abandoning stabilized territory without safeguards would invite resurgence. Zhao's unit, hardened and disciplined, expanded their scouting radius under his indirect guidance. Reporting that reclaimed villages had begun cultivating small fields again, cautious yet hopeful signs of human endurance returning to fractured land. During this consolidation phase, Lu Chen refined his internal resonance filtration, ensuring that accumulated traits from anchor and apex absorptions remained harmonized without drift, performing controlled exposure exercises near minor mutation clusters to test stability under stress. The distant southwestern pulses persisted, layered and rhythmic, occasionally flaring as if signaling across vast geography, and through spectral comparison he detected structural differences from former anchor undertone. These frequencies exhibited alternating dominance patterns rather than single baseline, implying multiple apex entities cooperating or rotating leadership within shared hierarchy. Such configuration suggested evolutionary sophistication potentially surpassing the singular root he had destroyed. Standing at dusk upon a ridge overlooking his concealed bunker, he acknowledged that venturing beyond national borders would risk encountering network complexity unlike any he had dismantled, yet inaction would allow foreign hierarchies to mature unchecked, and so he finalized preparations, sealing subterranean systems and transmitting final corridor advisories to Zhao, before turning his steps toward distant mountains where new harmonics awaited challenge. Chapter 57. Crossing into frontier territories required navigating landscapes scarred by both outbreak and conflict, where abandoned checkpoints and burned convoys marked chaotic evacuations of earlier months, and Lu Chen advanced with calculated stealth, minimizing active resonance to avoid alerting distant network structures whose range he could not yet quantify. As he climbed into higher altitudes, the southwestern pulses strengthened into braided harmonics, distinct yet interwoven, forming dynamic patterns that shifted in rotational cadence every few hours, a rhythm unlike the static dominance of the anchor or the rigid lattice of distributed transmitters. From a snow-dusted overlook he finally observed the epicenter, a vast plateau encircled by ruined wind turbines, their skeletal blades creaking in constant mountain wind, and within that ring multiple apex silhouettes occupied separated sectors, each commanding subordinate clusters while emitting pulses that intersected and overlapped without collapsing into singular rule. This was cooperative hierarchy rather than monolithic dominance, a consortium of apex entities maintaining balance through rotating broadcast precedents, allowing expansion without central vulnerability. Lu Chen recognized immediately that direct elimination of one could trigger retaliatory convergence from the others, escalating into full-scale coordinated assault unlike any previous encounter, and he retreated into concealment to observe. Rotational sequence, mapping timing intervals and identifying potential fault lines within their cooperative rhythm. Chapter 58. Extended surveillance revealed 5 distinct apex nodes arranged across the plateau, each assuming signal primacy for roughly 3-hour intervals before yielding to the next in cyclical succession, their harmonics overlapping briefly during transition to maintain uninterrupted network cohesion. This rotational governance distributed strain and reduced risk of singular decapitation, a strategic evolution that addressed vulnerabilities he had previously exploited, and Lu Chen acknowledged that dismantling such consortium required simultaneous destabilization rather than sequential elimination. He deployed microbeacons across surrounding ridgelines to measure interference thresholds, testing low-intensity pulses during transition overlaps to gauge response latency, and discovered that during handoff moments between dominant broadcasters, harmonic coherence dipped fractionally as command layers recalibrated. These micro-windows, though brief, represented exploitable fractures within the consortium's stability. Meanwhile, subordinate infected across plateau displayed disciplined formations resembling patrol grids rather than chaotic swarms, evidence that cooperative apex governance enhanced territorial security. As night settled over wind-torn turbines casting skeletal shadows across snow, Lu Chen finalized a high-risk strategy. Synchronize disruptive resonance precisely at transition apex, amplifying instability across all 5 nodes simultaneously before launching rapid strike assaults against 2 weakest sectors to trigger cascading breakdown across the rotational chain. Chapter 59. The operation commenced under moonless sky when the 3rd apex prepared to yield primacy to the 4th, and at the precise overlap interval Lu Chen activated ridge beacons at calibrated frequencies that inverted harmonic alignment across the plateau, creating interference spikes that propagated through rotational network like fractures in glass. The apexes reacted instantly, pulses surging in defensive amplification, yet overlapping broadcasts collided chaotically rather than coherently due to mistimed transition, destabilizing subordinate formations and generating confusion across patrol grids. Exploiting the disruption, Lu Chen descended toward the easternmost sector identified as lowest amplitude contributor, engaging its apex with explosive speed before neighboring nodes could re-establish coordination, targeting emission filaments first to prevent broadcast recovery. The duel unfolded atop turbine debris, blades clanging under impact as he shattered cranial ridges with precision strikes amplified by accumulated hierarchies, collapsing the first node within minutes. Without pause he pivoted toward adjacent sector whose broadcaster struggled to compensate for network fracture, and delivered similar decisive assault during its weakened recalibration phase, eliminating second node before cooperative rhythm could stabilize. Across plateau remaining three apexes surged in alarmed unison, yet rotational chain had broken, forcing them into reactive stance rather than orchestrated dominance, and Lu Chen withdrew temporarily to reassess shifting harmonic landscape now stripped of two pillars. Chapter 60. With two nodes eliminated, the Plateau Consortium devolved from cooperative governance into contested scramble as surviving three apexes abandoned rotational discipline and attempted to assert singular dominance, their pulses colliding violently and disrupting subordinate cohesion across sectors. Lu Chen monitored the chaos from elevated ridge, recognizing that internal rivalry would weaken them more effectively than immediate engagement, and allowed territorial clashes to escalate. For several hours as infected forces turned upon one another in fragmented allegiance, when one apex emerged temporarily ascendant, overextending its broadcast to suppress rivals, he intervened with concentrated disruptor surge time to coincide with its peak output, causing catastrophic feedback that fractured its neural lattice and left it vulnerable to swift elimination. The remaining two, battered and destabilized, retreated toward opposite ends of plateau in desperate bid to consolidate. Remnants, yet without rotational structure, their territories overlapped chaotically, inviting further attrition. Seizing momentum, Lu Chen hunted each sequentially under cover of internal disorder, dismantling them through targeted resonance spikes that exploited weakened emission pathways. As dawn broke over silent wind turbines, the plateau lay devoid of apex governance. Cooperative experiment reduced to scattered remnants, standing amid snow and twisted metal. Lu Chen extended his perception outward and sensed no immediate rotational harmonics beyond the mountains, understanding that he had dismantled not only a consortium but a new evolutionary model, yet aware that innovation would persist elsewhere as long as mutation sought structure against the fragile persistence of humanity. Chapter 61. The collapse of the Plateau Consortium echoed across the surrounding ranges in fractured pulses, lesser mutation clusters flickering briefly before fading into directionless drift, and Lu Chen remained in the highlands for several days to ensure no surviving apex attempted clandestine consolidation beneath the snowbound ridges. He mapped the residual harmonic debris carefully, identifying stray emission fragments dissipating like embers after wildfire, and confirmed that the rotational model had failed without immediate successor, leaving frontier territories temporarily unstructured. Yet within that silence he detected something subtler, microharmonics emerging not from singular sources but from dispersed coordinates across distant valleys, faint and asynchronous, as if multiple minor variants were experimenting independently with signal layering. This pattern differed from organized consortium and resembled evolutionary trial and error occurring in parallel. Decentralized yet potentially convergent if left unchecked, rather than eliminate each microsource individually, which would demand unsustainable travel across vast terrain. Lu Chen began developing broader spectrum dampening fields deployable across entire valleys to suppress harmonic experimentation at early stages, constructing portable resonance towers from salvaged turbine components. He installed the first prototype at Plateau Center, activating a low, steady counterfrequency designed to destabilize signal coherence before hierarchical patterns could solidify. Observing gradual decline in microharmonic intensity over subsequent days, he recognized the potential of environmental modulation as preventive strategy, reducing need for constant lethal intervention while preserving equilibrium through subtle suppression rather than overt dominance. Chapter 62. Returning eastward along mountainous corridors, Lu Chen carried refined dampening prototypes, deploying them strategically at crossroads where geographic acoustics favored mutation amplification, effectively transforming terrain into passive resistance network against apex resurgence. Zhao's encrypted transmissions reported improved trade routes between enclaves, caravans moving cautiously yet consistently through valleys once impassable, and although survivors remained unaware of the silent systems stabilizing their environment. Their persistence validated his evolving doctrine of stewardship over slaughter. During one installation near a narrow canyon, he encountered a lone variant displaying unusual behavior. Rather than hunting humans or infected, it dismantled resonance beacons he had placed days earlier, suggesting rudimentary recognition of harmonic interference. Engaging the creature revealed moderate cognitive adaptation but insufficient power to challenge him directly, and after neutralizing it, he analyzed its neural tissue to discover primitive pattern recognition circuits responding specifically to counter-frequency emissions. The finding indicated that mutation itself was beginning to adapt to his suppression tactics, albeit at early stage, and he adjusted beacon algorithms to vary output unpredictably, preventing consistent target profiles.
As dusk painted canyon walls in fading gold, Lu Chen acknowledged that even preventative measures must evolve continuously, for the plague's resilience manifested not only in apex strength but in incremental adaptation against containment itself.
Chapter 63. In early summer, a massive storm system swept across western provinces, lightning igniting forest fires that raged unchecked through abandoned regions, and Lu Chen detected rapid resonance fluctuations within burning zones where intense heat and electromagnetic discharge interacted unpredictably with residual mutation clusters. Traveling toward the largest blaze, he observed that lightning strikes upon mineral-rich ridgelines amplified subterranean vibrations, inadvertently generating harmonic surges similar to artificial dam resonance he had previously neutralized, and within one charred valley he discovered a newly forming node coalescing around a lightning-scarred cliff face, its emission unstable yet accelerating under repeated electrical stimulation. Understanding that natural phenomena could catalyze spontaneous apex genesis even without anchor or consortium support, he constructed an improvised grounding lattice using conductive debris to redirect lightning away from resonance focal point while deploying dampeners tuned to the storm's electromagnetic frequency. Over successive strikes, redirected currents dissipated harmlessly across improvised grid, and the nascent node's growth plateaued before collapsing into inert mutation mass susceptible to swift elimination. As smoke thinned and rain finally subdued the blaze, Lu Chen recorded environmental variables contributing to spontaneous hierarchy formation, expanding his strategic model to incorporate meteorological triggers alongside biological evolution, recognizing that containment now required anticipating interplay between nature's forces and the plague's adaptive capacity. Chapter 64. Months of sustained intervention across frontier regions gradually reduced harmonic volatility to manageable baseline, and Lu Chen returned periodically to Sichuan to recalibrate bunker systems and assess human settlement growth, observing fields tilled near distant villages and watchtowers erected along ridgelines once overrun by synchronized hordes. Zhao's unit, now central to a loose federation of enclaves, maintained disciplined patrols while respecting the unseen boundaries Lu Chen had established, their survival increasingly attributable to absence of organized mutation rather than overt military might. Yet in quiet moments atop familiar hills, he felt subtle fatigue within layered resonance architecture of his own being, not weakness, but cumulative weight of harmonics absorbed across countless confrontations, a reminder that he remained biological entity despite augmented endurance. Instituting longer recovery intervals within isolation chamber beneath farmhouse, he monitored neural stability and pruned minor traits that risked redundancy or internal conflict, refining himself as carefully as he had refined the world's balance. During one such recalibration he sensed faint tremor far to the north beyond previous operational radius, not strong enough to constitute immediate threat but distinct in pattern, slow, deliberate pulses emerging from sparsely populated tundra-like expanses. He logged the anomaly without immediate pursuit, understanding that vigilance must balance with conservation, yet aware that the evolutionary frontier remained vast and unpredictable. Chapter 65. As autumn returned, the northern tremor intensified gradually, resolving into dual-layered harmonics intertwined rather than competing, and Lu Chen interpreted the signature as potential symbiotic mutation, two entities evolving cooperatively at foundational level rather than through imposed hierarchy. Recognizing the novelty and risk of such configuration, he prepared for another long-range expedition, securing Sichuan's stabilizing network before advancing north across barren highlands where wind cut sharply and human presence was nearly non-existent. From a distant ridge overlooking icy plains, he observed twin apex forms moving in mirrored patterns around a frozen lake, their pulses synchronized not in rotation but in constant parallel alignment, sharing energy bidirectionally rather than alternating control. Subordinate infected in the region displayed unusually efficient hunting coordination despite low density, suggesting that symbiosis enhanced precision rather than territorial breadth. Lu Chen understood that dismantling one without neutralizing the other could result in adaptive reinforcement, and thus he began mapping shared resonance nodes between them, searching for coupling points vulnerable to simultaneous disruption. As cold winds swept across the frozen expanse and twin silhouettes traced mirrored arcs beneath pale sky, he steadied his layered pulse, preparing to confront yet another evolutionary experiment born from chaos, aware that each innovation tested not only his strength but his capacity to adapt faster than the plague reinvented itself. Chapter 66. From the ridge above the frozen lake, Lucian observed the twin apexes for 3 full cycles of daylight, confirming that their resonance did not merely align but interlock through constant bidirectional exchange, forming a stable harmonic braid that resisted minor interference. When one moved, the other adjusted preemptively, not in delayed response but near simultaneous anticipation, suggesting shared predictive feedback rather than simple signal relay, subordinate infected. Beneath them operated in paired units as well, mirroring patrol routes across the ice in symmetrical arcs that minimized blind zones, and Lucian recognized that traditional decapitation strategy would fail unless the harmonic bridge between the twins was severed at exact moment of maximum synchronization. Deploying concealed microbeacons across the lake's perimeter, he began testing phase offset pulses designed to desynchronize their shared cadence incrementally rather than violently, because abrupt disruption might trigger defensive amplification from both simultaneously. Over successive hours, he detected microfluctuations within the braid during temperature shifts at dusk, when thermal contraction of ice subtly altered vibrational propagation, and he identified these environmental transitions as potential leverage points. As night fell and aurora shimmered faintly above the northern sky, Lucian finalized a synchronized disruptor pattern calibrated to exploit temperature-induced phase variance, preparing to fracture the braid not through force alone but by turning the environment itself into destabilizing instrument. Chapter 67. At the coldest interval before dawn, when ice contracted and air sharpened to brittle stillness, Lucian activated perimeter beacons in precise sequence, injecting phase offset frequencies that rode naturally upon environmental contraction waves across the lake's surface, and for a fleeting second the harmonic braid between the twin apexes thinned perceptibly, their pulses no longer perfectly aligned but fractionally misphased. Seizing the moment, he descended onto the frozen expanse. With explosive acceleration, targeting the nearer twin first while maintaining a secondary disruptor pulse aimed toward its counterpart to prevent immediate reinforcement, the engaged apex reacted with ferocity, claws carving shards from ice as it countered his strikes, yet without flawless synchronization its anticipatory advantage faltered by critical milliseconds. Driving resonance spikes directly into exposed cranial filaments, he forced deeper desynchronization that reverberated along the braid and elicited visible destabilization in the distant twin, whose movements stuttered briefly as shared feedback loops strained under conflicting inputs. Recognizing opportunity narrow and fleeting, Lucian intensified output beyond previous thresholds, fracturing the braid entirely in cascading harmonic collapse that echoed across frozen lake like thunder beneath ice. And with decisive thrust he shattered the first apex's neural core, leaving its twin momentarily isolated in shocked instability. Chapter 68. The surviving twin responded not with immediate retreat but with desperate amplification attempt, projecting its pulse outward in chaotic surge to compensate for lost partner, yet without braided feedback its emission oscillated unpredictably, destabilizing subordinate coordination and cracking ice beneath its own movements. Lucian advanced relentlessly, aware that delay would allow partial recalibration, and engaged in high-velocity exchange across fracturing surface where each step risked plunging into freezing depths. The apex fought with raw intensity, but its once fluid anticipation had devolved into erratic aggression, and he exploited exposed overextensions to deliver targeted strikes along emission filaments already strained from feedback overload. At peak of confrontation he triggered concentrated disruptor burst directly into its cranial ridge, forcing harmonic inversion that collided with residual imprint of its fallen twin, creating internal interference. Beyond correction, with final blow he pierced neural nexus and withdrew as the creature convulsed, its body collapsing through shattered ice into dark water below, extending perception across the tundra. Lucian sensed the braided harmonic vanish entirely, replaced by vast, unstructured silence. Standing amid drifting snow and fractured ice, he acknowledged that symbiotic evolution had been dismantled before maturation, yet its existence confirmed the plague's capacity to innovate beyond singular dominance or consortium models, reinforcing necessity of constant adaptation against ever-shifting architectures. Chapter 69. Absorbing minimal neural fragments from the first twin while allowing the second to sink unrecovered, Lucian integrated only coupling analysis traits that enhanced his ability to detect synchronized pulses between distant entities, refining his perception toward early identification of cooperative mutation before it solidified. Traveling southward again, He extended harmonic sweeps across provinces and discovered scattered faint pairings attempting crude synchronization, likely influenced by evolutionary pressure rather than anchor guidance, and he suppressed these nascent braids through subtle dampening rather than overt elimination, disrupting coupling at formative stage to prevent escalation. Zhao's network of enclaves reported increasingly rare encounters with organized infected, yet occasional reports described isolated duos hunting with unnerving coordination. Validating his detection model, by intervening quietly before such pairs matured, he reduced risk. Without drawing unnecessary attention to his presence, as winter loosened its grip and thaw softened northern plains, Lucian paused upon a windswept ridge overlooking vast territories now largely free from structured hierarchy, sensing only scattered sparks of mutation flickering without convergence. For the first time since awakening in Beijing months ago, he allowed himself extended stillness beneath open sky, acknowledging that while the plague endured, its capacity to unify had been repeatedly fractured, and his vigilance had transformed continental threat into fragmented survival landscape where humanity could endure cautiously rather than cower beneath orchestrated annihilation. Chapter 70. Returning once more to Sichuan's quiet hills, Lucian descended into the reinforced bunker not as desperate fugitive but as architect of equilibrium, reviewing months of data stored within subterranean servers, resonance maps, suppression algorithms, environmental triggers, evolutionary archetypes, all evidence of a war fought largely unseen. Zhao's federation had grown into structured alliance of enclaves exchanging resources and knowledge, unaware of the precise mechanisms stabilizing their borders yet benefiting from corridors kept clear by invisible counternode. Standing within isolation chamber where his first transformation had nearly consumed him, he reflected on the path from betrayal and vengeance to stewardship and relentless adaptation, recognizing that power alone had never been sufficient, only disciplined control over that power preserved humanity's chance. Extending his perception outward one final time before rest, he detected no immediate apex rising, no undertone anchoring distant provinces, only faint, scattered pulses flickering like isolated embers in dark, sealing bunker doors for a prolonged recovery cycle. Lucian accepted that vigilance would never truly end, yet for this season at least the world breathed without unified predator looming overhead, and he, forged through death and rebirth, remained watchful sentinel against whatever new form evolution might one day attempt to impose upon the fragile persistence of mankind. Chapter 71. Rest did not dull Lucian's vigilance. Even within the reinforced quiet of his Sichuan bunker, his perception extended outward in habitual sweeps, mapping the continent in layered gradients of faint resonance, and for several weeks he detected nothing beyond minor, self-extinguishing mutation sparks that flared and faded without coherence. Zhao's federation expanded cautiously, converting abandoned rail depots into trade hubs and establishing crop rotations that hinted at long-term recovery rather than mere survival, and although Lucian remained unseen, he adjusted dampening towers remotely to maintain invisible buffer zones around growing settlements. Yet during a late summer storm rolling down from northern steppes, he felt an unfamiliar tremor ripple through his perception, not strong, not organized, but vast in scope, a diffuse harmonic spreading like atmospheric pressure rather than focused node. Ascending to the farmhouse roof beneath rain-swept clouds, he isolated the signal's direction and realized it did not originate from terrestrial mutation cluster but from migratory movement across borders far to the west, where caravan-sized infected masses drifted steadily eastward without apex command. Analyzing the pattern, he understood this was not resurgence of hierarchy but inertia of residual continental drift, a slow migration of scattered hordes displaced by previous collapses, converging unpredictably toward fertile regions now reclaimed by humans. While lacking organized leadership, their sheer volume could devastate fragile enclaves through brute accumulation alone, and Lucian recognized that the next phase of stewardship would require confronting not intelligence but scale, reshaping geography itself to prevent catastrophic convergence. Chapter 72. He began by projecting probable migration paths based on terrain funnels and river valleys, identifying three primary corridors that would guide drifting hordes toward Sichuan's developing agricultural basin, and rather than attempt impossible extermination of tens of thousands individually, he devised redirection strategy using resonance beacons configured to emit low-grade attractor frequencies calibrated to draw infected toward uninhabited highlands, deploying portable emitters along alternate mountain passes. He established artificial gradients guiding migration away from human settlements, then triggered controlled demolitions along narrow canyon choke points to collapse access routes toward vulnerable valleys. Over subsequent days he monitored the vast columns alter trajectory gradually, like rivers diverted by subtle shifts in landscape, their movement redirected toward barren plateaus where food scarcity and environmental exposure would thin their numbers. Naturally, Zhao's scouts reported distant rumbling migrations yet no direct incursions into inhabited zones, unaware that invisible currents steered danger elsewhere. While overseeing the redirection from elevated ridge, Lu Chen felt renewed respect for scale of apocalypse beyond apex duels. Sometimes survival demanded not surgical strike but continental engineering, and as dust clouds rose far in the distance marking redirected hordes, he acknowledged that shaping the land's harmonic contours could preserve humanity without constant bloodshed, provided he anticipated movement before it crystallized into irreversible disaster. Chapter 73. Though redirection proved effective initially, Lu Chen soon detected anomalous resistance within one migration column where clusters began ignoring attractor gradients and deviating toward settlements despite countersignals, indicating emergent anomaly within otherwise leaderless mass. Tracking the deviation revealed a mid-tier variant evolving amidst density, not powerful enough to form full apex but capable of generating localized cohesion sufficient to override environmental guidance, its pulse erratic yet increasingly assertive as it fed upon neural tissue from fallen infected along the march. Recognizing the danger of spontaneous hierarchy emerging within large-scale drift, he intercepted the column at a desolate ravine where terrain narrowed their movement, infiltrating through outer ranks under suppressed resonance and targeting the emergent coordinator before it matured further. The confrontation lacked grandeur of prior apex battles yet carried equal urgency. For within the swarm's density minor synchronization amplified rapidly, and after swift elimination of the coordinator through precise cranial disruption, he triggered resonance burst dispersing immediate cluster and restoring leaderless inertia to the mass. Observing the redirected horde resume its westward drift toward uninhabited plateau, Lu Chen concluded that vigilance against scale required continuous scanning for embryonic structure, because even absent anchor or consortium, evolution sought order whenever conditions favored concentration. Chapter 74. Autumn's approach signaled another seasonal transition, and with harvests underway across survivor enclaves, Lu Chen intensified monitoring along perimeters, ensuring that redirected hordes dissipated rather than reconverged under new coordination, while Zhao's federation strengthened fortifications and began tentative expansion into former urban fringes. During one reconnaissance sweep near an abandoned megacity's outskirts, he detected curious phenomenon, infected within dense ruins exhibited no organized pulse yet remained unusually dormant, clustering in subterranean parking structures without migrating or hunting aggressively. Investigating the anomaly revealed environmental resonance dampening caused by metallic infrastructure and collapsed subterranean transit systems that absorbed and scattered harmonic signals, creating natural suppression zone akin to his engineered towers. Recognizing opportunity, he mapped the city as potential long-term quarantine basin, where redirected hordes could be funneled and contained passively by architecture rather than active intervention. Installing minimal guidance beacons along outer highways, he began channeling drifting masses toward this urban sink, transforming decayed metropolis into vast containment labyrinth where resonance interference limited evolution and prevented large-scale coordination. Standing atop a skyscraper skeleton overlooking silent avenues filled with inert infected clusters, Lu Chen saw proof that sometimes ruins themselves could serve as guardians, and that apocalypse's scars might become tools for preserving the fragile resurgence of human life beyond their shadow. Chapter 75. Winter settled again across Sichuan and surrounding provinces, yet this season felt fundamentally different from the first brutal year. No synchronized migrations thundered across valleys, no apex pulses loomed at continental scale, only scattered pockets contained within natural or engineered suppression zones. Zhao's federation reported birth of children within secure enclaves for the first time since outbreak, fragile symbols of continuity that Lu Chen observed from afar with quiet acknowledgement rather than sentimentality. Extending perception across immense radius, he sensed only faint, isolated mutations flickering and fading without convergence, evolutionary sparks unable to ignite coordinated blaze in absence of anchor or stable consortium. Descending once more into his reinforced bunker, he reviewed accumulated data spanning every archetype he had encountered: territorial brute, distributed transmitter, cooperative consortium, symbiotic braid, environmental catalyst, and refined global suppression algorithms capable of responding autonomously should new pattern arise. As steel doors sealed behind him and systems hummed steadily in subterranean quiet, Lu Chen accepted that his vigilance would endure indefinitely, not driven by revenge now but by disciplined guardianship forged through countless confrontations. The world above remained scarred yet breathing, humanity fragile yet persistent, and while mutation would never vanish entirely, its ambition to dominate had been fractured repeatedly by a solitary counternode who refused to yield, ensuring that under cold stars and changing seasons alike, organized annihilation would never again rise unchecked across the land. Chapter 76. Years did not pass, but but seasons layered into one another with steadier rhythm, and Lu Chen remained vigilant even as the world above him shifted from desperate survival to cautious reconstruction, extending perceptual sweeps beyond former boundaries and calibrating suppression networks with incremental refinements that reduced harmonic anomalies before they coalesced. The megacity quarantine basin functioned as intended, redirected hordes thinning gradually within its metallic labyrinth while dampened infrastructure prevented signal alignment sufficient for apex gestation, and Zhao's Federation expanded agricultural belts outward under carefully staggered watch schedules. Yet in early spring, Lu Chen sensed an unfamiliar phenomenon, not a concentrated pulse nor a migration drift, but a diffuse rise in baseline mutation density across multiple provinces simultaneously.
Subtle increases in minor harmonic flickers that did not align or converge yet persisted with unusual
durability. Analyzing environmental data, he correlated the shift with gradual climatic warming and increasing human movement between enclaves, factors that inadvertently redistributed infected carriers into previously suppressed zones. While no hierarchy emerged, the sheer persistence of minor mutations suggested a new evolutionary phase driven by ecological integration rather than dominance. And he understood that containment strategies must adapt again, not to dismantle apexes but to manage coexistence risk between growing human populations and lingering mutation reservoirs. Standing upon the farmhouse ridge at dusk, watching cultivated fields ripple beneath mild wind, Lu Chen acknowledged that the war had shifted into subtler territory where vigilance required nuance rather than constant battle. Chapter 77. To address rising baseline mutation density, Lu Chen began developing a mobile resonance filtration system designed not to attract or repel infected, but to dampen their neural activity within localized radius, effectively reducing aggression and slowing mutation cycles without triggering defensive amplification. Deploying prototypes near high-traffic trade corridors, he observed promising results as infected wandering within filtration zones exhibited lethargic behavior and diminished coordination, allowing patrols to neutralize them with minimal risk. However, prolonged exposure revealed adaptive responses among certain variants whose neural pathways thickened gradually to resist dampening effects, a slow evolutionary countermeasure emerging through repeated low-intensity selection pressure. Recognizing the risk of breeding suppression-resistant strains, Lu Chen recalibrated filtration to operate intermittently and unpredictably rather than continuously, preventing consistent environmental conditioning. Meanwhile, Zhao's Federation initiated educational exchanges between enclaves, sharing agricultural techniques and rudimentary medical research into infection resistance, unaware that invisible modulation fields shielded their efforts from resurgence. Observing this fragile resurgence of civilization, Lu Chen maintained strict emotional detachment yet felt quiet affirmation that his interventions had shifted humanity from brink of extinction to precarious stability. Still, beneath layered calm he detected faint harmonic experiments flickering along distant coasts where maritime winds carried infected between ports, reminding him that evolution's frontier extended wherever human remnants and mutation remnants intersected unpredictably. Chapter 78. Investigating coastal flickers required traversing long-abandoned industrial harbors where rusted cranes loomed like skeletal guardians over silent docks, and Lu Chen detected minor harmonic clusters forming among ship graveyards where metallic hulls created acoustic cavities capable of amplifying resonance unpredictably. Within one container yard he discovered a congregation of infected occupying stacked cargo units arranged inadvertently into resonant chambers that magnified shared neural impulses, creating temporary amplification pockets that mimicked low-tier apex behavior without centralized entity. Dismantling the arrangement required structural alteration rather than combat, so he collapsed container stacks systematically, disrupting geometric alignment and dispersing amplification before neutralizing remaining variants. This pattern reinforced earlier lesson from hydroelectric dam and megacity basin. Architecture could both nurture and suppress hierarchy depending on configuration. Integrating these insights, he compiled environmental resonance maps highlighting high-risk structures across provinces and transmitted anonymized advisories to Zhao's engineers to avoid specific reconstruction patterns that might inadvertently foster mutation amplification. As evening sun sank beyond the sea, casting long reflections across quiet harbor waters, Lu Chen felt the layered cadence within his veins steady and controlled, aware that safeguarding humanity now depended as much on understanding physical spaces as on defeating living threats. Chapter 79. Midsummer brought renewed trade caravans along former highway corridors, and Lu Chen expanded surveillance outward once more to ensure rising human movement did not intersect with dormant mutation clusters in destabilizing ways. During one long-range sweep he sensed peculiar harmonic void, a zone where mutation presence should have been moderate yet registered almost non-existent, not due to suppression field but absence itself. Traveling to investigate, he discovered an enclave that had independently developed crude sonic deterrent devices emitting continuous white noise frequencies, unintentionally creating broad-spectrum dampening field that repelled infected effectively. Observing from concealed vantage, he recognized ingenuity born from necessity, and though their technology lacked sophistication, it demonstrated humanity's capacity to innovate parallel to his unseen guardianship. Rather than interfere, he analyzed their acoustic parameters and subtly adjusted his own regional dampeners to complement rather than conflict with their signals, ensuring no harmonic gaps emerged between systems. Watching villagers move confidently within their self-crafted safety zone, he acknowledged that humanity no longer relied solely on invisible protector, and that his role increasingly shifted from active savior to silent optimizer of conditions enabling independent resilience. Yet even as hope flickered stronger among enclaves, faint distant tremors persisted at the edge of his perception, reminders that mutation never vanished entirely, only adapted to constraints imposed upon it. Chapter 80. As the second winter since Anchor's fall approached, Lucian conducted comprehensive continental sweep, extending perception to its furthest stable range and mapping every identifiable harmonic fluctuation across mountains, plains, coasts, and tundra. What he found was not resurgence of hierarchy but mosaic of microecosystems, isolated mutation pockets balanced precariously against expanding human settlements, neither side dominant yet neither eradicated. He concluded that the apocalypse had transitioned into equilibrium phase, unstable but sustainable so long as no single innovation tipped scales toward renewed organization. Descending into his bunker's central chamber, he archived updated resonance atlas alongside detailed environmental risk models, preparing automated contingencies capable of activating should large-scale harmonic alignment re-emerge beyond his immediate reach. Standing alone within steel-lined silence, he reflected briefly on path from betrayed victim to continental sentinel, recognizing that revenge had long since dissolved into broader purpose shaped by necessity rather than emotion. Extending perception one final time before sealing for extended recalibration cycle, he sensed only scattered flickers under vast winter sky, no undertone, no consortium, no braided symbiosis, only fragmented remnants held in check by vigilance and adaptation. Closing his eyes beneath reinforced ceiling, Lucian accepted that survival was no longer a desperate struggle against imminent extinction but an ongoing guardianship against evolution's ambition, and he remained ready, should the world ever again attempt to unify its darkness into something capable of challenging humanity's fragile, hard-won return. Chapter 81. The extended recalibration cycle lasted nearly a month, during which Lucian minimized external intervention and allowed automated dampening grids to regulate regional fluctuations, using the time to analyze long-term mutation data trends compiled since the Anchor's destruction. Statistical projections revealed encouraging stability yet also subtle upward creep and adaptive variance among isolated pockets, suggesting that while large-scale hierarchy had been shattered, evolutionary experimentation continued at micro-level with incremental refinements accumulating over time. Emerging patterns indicated certain strains favored camouflage and evasion over dominance, blending into wilderness and avoiding direct conflict with humans or other infected, effectively becoming ecological scavengers rather than apex aspirants.
Lucian recognized potential danger in such silent adaptations, for invisibility could mature unnoticed until density reached tipping point, reactivating full
perceptual sweep. He traced several camouflaged clusters within dense bamboo forests southwest of Sichuan where thermal signatures masked neural pulses effectively, infiltrating the region. He observed variants capable of suppressing outward resonance almost entirely, mimicking environmental background noise to avoid detection. Dismantling them required physical tracking rather than harmonic guidance, testing skills he had nearly abandoned. After neutralizing core individuals and dispersing cluster, he logged new archetype, stealth-adapted mutation, evolution's response to persistent surveillance. Returning to open terrain, he accepted that each layer of containment inevitably shaped the next mutation wave, and vigilance must remain flexible enough to counter adaptations born specifically to evade him. Chapter 82. Reports from Zhao's Federation soon aligned with his findings, describing livestock disappearing near forest edges without visible infected presence, and Lucian expanded his search grid to encompass rural perimeters where stealth strains might exploit proximity to human expansion. Along one river delta thick with reeds, he detected faint disturbance patterns inconsistent with wind or wildlife and discovered small hunting packs operating without harmonic coordination, communicating instead through subtle physical cues and scent marking rather than resonance pulses. These strains represented evolutionary branch less dependent on neural broadcast and more reliant on biological instinct, potentially immune to dampening fields that targeted harmonic activity. Confronting them demanded direct engagement in complex terrain where visibility remained limited, and after several swift skirmishes he identified key pack leaders exhibiting marginally stronger neural nodes responsible for rudimentary coordination. Eliminating these leaders fractured pack structure quickly, confirming that while resonance had diminished in importance for this strain, hierarchy still emerged through other mechanisms. Analyzing harvested tissue, he concluded that mutation was diversifying beyond frequency-based evolution into behavioral specialization, a sign that plague's adaptive horizon remained vast, reinforcing rural monitoring protocols and advising Zhao's patrols to adjust scouting patterns accordingly. Lu Chen acknowledged that guardianship now required understanding ecological dynamics as deeply as harmonic structures. Chapter 83. Spring returned with heavier rainfall than previous years, flooding lowland plains and displacing both human settlements and infected clusters into elevated zones where temporary overcrowding increased mutation pressure. Lu Chen detected several convergence hotspots forming along hilltop ruins where survivors sought refuge from rising waters while infected drifted upward seeking dry ground, creating volatile proximity between populations, rather than intervene through elimination. Alone, he coordinated subtle redirection by adjusting dampeners to create safe corridors guiding infected toward alternate ridges, reducing direct conflict without revealing his presence. In one particularly precarious scenario near a flooded quarry, he physically intervened to dismantle an emerging coordinator variant that exploited chaos to rally waterlogged infected into concentrated assault against stranded villagers. The confrontation unfolded amid torrential rain and unstable slopes, yet decisive elimination restored disarray among attackers long enough for survivors to evacuate safely along ridge path he had pre-cleared. As floodwaters receded weeks later, he reviewed event logs and recognized climate variability as significant driver of mutation dynamics, necessitating integration of meteorological forecasting into his containment algorithms. Watching new grass sprout from soaked earth near reclaimed farmland, Lu Chen accepted that stewardship now meant anticipating not only evolutionary creativity but environmental volatility interacting with lingering infection across fragile recovering world. Chapter 84. In early summer, scouts reported discovery of an isolated research facility in mountainous interior, rumored to contain pre-collapse virological data that might illuminate origins of outbreak, and though Lu Chen had long prioritized present containment over past explanation, curiosity and strategic foresight compelled investigation. Infiltrating the sealed compound, he navigated dormant security systems powered intermittently by failing generators and located archival servers containing fragmented records of experimental neural interface studies intersecting with pathogen research, suggesting that the original outbreak may have combined viral mutation with bioelectric augmentation, inadvertently amplifying neural transmission among hosts. Analyzing corrupted files, he inferred that the anchor phenomenon likely emerged where high-density experimental strains encountered optimal geological resonance conditions, catalyzing continental undertone. The knowledge provided retrospective clarity yet little immediate tactical advantage, for the plague had long since evolved beyond laboratory parameters. Before departing, he extracted surviving data drives and destroyed unstable containment vaults to prevent accidental release of dormant samples. Emerging from facility under clear mountain sky, Lu Chen felt neither vindication nor anger, only confirmation that humanity's ambition had inadvertently birthed catastrophe, and that his ongoing guardianship represented attempt not to undo past mistakes but to prevent their consequences from reorganizing into extinction once more. Chapter 85. By late summer, the continent exhibited stable fragmentation with no macroharmonic resurgence, and Zhao's federation proposed tentative reoccupation of select urban districts under strict quarantine measures. Lu Chen evaluated proposed zones for architectural resonance risks and stealth strain habitats, providing anonymous environmental assessments through encrypted channels that subtly guided reconstruction towards safer configurations. In one reclaimed district, he observed children playing within barricaded courtyard while adults reinforced outer perimeters with scavenged materials, and though he remained distant and unseen, the image marked tangible contrast to early days of sirens and chaos. Extending perception across provinces, he sensed only scattered flickers, manageable, isolated, contained. Descending once more into his bunker's central chamber, he archived another seasonal dataset and adjusted suppression towers to lower output slightly, testing whether equilibrium could sustain itself with reduced intervention. Days passed without harmonic escalation, confirming that humanity's cautious expansion no longer immediately triggered mutation consolidation. Standing at the farmhouse threshold as evening sun dipped behind Sichuan hills, Lu Chen acknowledged that while the plague endured in fragments, its ambition to unify had been repeatedly thwarted, and the world now existed in precarious balance maintained not by fear or revenge, but by
Relentless, disciplined adaptation against evolution's every attempt to rise again.
Chapter 86. The reduction in suppression output held through early autumn without measurable escalation, and Lu Chen interpreted this as tentative proof that mutation density had stabilized below critical threshold, yet he refused complacency and initiated randomized stress tests across remote regions by temporarily deactivating isolated dampening nodes to observe natural response. In most areas, minor flickers rose briefly before dissipating without convergence, confirming weakened structural drive toward hierarchy, but in one remote desert basin far northwest he detected unusual persistence following test deactivation, a low but steady harmonic gathering beneath shifting dunes. Traveling there under cover of night, he discovered an underground aquifer system sustaining dense infected clusters shielded from surface detection by sand's insulating properties, their neural activity accumulating slowly in confined caverns where acoustic reflection amplified pulses incrementally, rather than allow subterranean resonance to mature unseen. He installed deep-bore dampening probes into aquifer chambers, flooding them with controlled counter-frequency that diffused harmonic buildup and prevented crystallization into apex nucleus. Over subsequent days the basin's anomaly faded, demonstrating that unseen geographies still harbored potential incubators even in era of equilibrium. Standing atop windswept dunes as dawn painted horizon in muted gold, Lu Chen reaffirmed doctrine that stability required probing hidden spaces regularly, because threats no longer announced themselves loudly but gestated quietly beneath terrain until conditions favored emergence. Chapter 87. Winter winds returned sharper than previous years, sweeping across plains and driving isolated infected into abandoned industrial zones where shelter from cold increased density temporarily. Lu Chen observed several such clusters forming near decommissioned factories and, recalling lessons from coastal container yards and hydroelectric dam, preemptively dismantled structural resonance risks by collapsing hollow steel frameworks and disrupting echo chambers before neural pulses could synchronize. During one intervention he encountered small group of human scavengers trapped within factory maze as infected pressed from outer corridors, and though direct exposure risked revealing his presence, he intervened swiftly, neutralizing key variants and activating localized dampener bursts that rendered remaining infected sluggish long enough for scavengers to escape. He vanished before they could identify their rescuer, maintaining anonymity essential to broader strategy. Afterward, reviewing internal logs, he noted subtle emotional response to witnessing survivors' resilience, a flicker of guarded hope tempered by memory of betrayal that had shaped his rebirth, yet he neither suppressed nor indulged the feeling, allowing it to exist without altering vigilance. As snow began falling across silent factory roofs, he extended perception outward once more, sensing continents steady beneath fractured sky, aware that while apex hierarchies had been dismantled, humanity's endurance now depended equally upon its own capacity to adapt responsibly within the fragile ecosystem he had helped stabilize. Chapter 88. Early spring thaw revealed new pattern along southern river systems where rising trade between enclaves increased river traffic, inadvertently disturbing dormant infected within partially submerged towns, and Lu Chen detected minor harmonic upticks along waterways as boat engines reverberated through flooded streets acting as temporary amplifiers. Traveling by night across riverbanks, he observed that repeated mechanical vibrations were stimulating residual neural tissue within submerged clusters, accelerating mutation cycles modestly though not yet to apex threshold. Instead of eliminating all such clusters, he modified river corridor strategy by installing submerged resonance diffusers along key choke points, devices that absorbed and scattered engine vibrations to prevent constructive amplification beneath water. After implementation, harmonic spikes diminished noticeably even as trade continued, allowing human expansion without triggering structural resurgence. Zhao's engineers, guided by anonymous schematics, incorporated similar diffusers into new bridge designs, unknowingly aligning reconstruction with mutation-resistant principles. As river currents carried reflected starlight through quiet valleys, Lu Chen recognized that Apocalypse's legacy required harmonizing human infrastructure with environmental physics, ensuring that rebuilding civilization did not inadvertently recreate conditions once exploited by evolving plague. Chapter 89. Late summer brought reports of distant tremors beyond continental borders once more, not concentrated but rhythmic, suggesting organized activity across oceanic regions unreachable by land. Extending perception to its furthest stable limit, Lu Chen sensed faint braided pulses echoing from far western horizons, too distant for precise mapping yet undeniably structured. Whether remnants of foreign anchor-like systems or independent evolutionary trajectories, their presence reminded him that equilibrium within his guarded territories did not guarantee global stability. Though crossing oceans lay beyond his current logistical scope, he began compiling comprehensive resonance archives detailing archetypes, suppression methodologies, and environmental risk factors, storing redundant copies within secure bunkers and transmitting encrypted fragments through surviving satellite relays in hope that distant survivors might decode and adapt the knowledge. He understood that solitary guardianship could not span entire planet indefinitely, and that dissemination of understanding represented next stage of containment. Standing at cliff overlooking reclaimed farmland bathed in amber sunset, he accepted that while his vigilance had transformed regional catastrophe into manageable coexistence, evolution elsewhere might follow parallel paths, and preparedness required not only strength but shared insight capable of preventing repetition of continental near extinction. Chapter 90. As another year approached since the anchor's fall, Lucian conducted final extensive continental sweep, confirming absence of emergent macro-hierarchy and stability of suppression networks integrated subtly within rebuilt human infrastructure. Zhao's federation had grown into decentralized alliance spanning multiple provinces, their resilience rooted not in ignorance but cautious awareness of lingering threat, guided indirectly by anonymous advisories that shaped safer expansion. Descending into his Sichuan bunker one quiet evening, Lu Chen reviewed the arc of his transformation, from betrayed man awakening in Beijing apartment to unseen sentinel reshaping mutation's evolutionary course, and felt layered resonance within his veins, steady, controlled, no longer surging with relentless escalation but calibrated for endurance. Sealing outer hatch beneath quiet farmhouse soil, he initiated long-duration monitoring protocol that would awaken him instantly should continental harmonics begin converging again. Lying within reinforced chamber where steel once symbolized desperate survival, he allowed brief stillness, knowing that apocalypse had not ended but evolved into equilibrium balanced precariously between humanity's rebuilding and mutation's persistence. Beyond hills, fields rustled softly under night wind, free from coordinated horde and anchor's undertone, and though distant horizons still held unknown pulses, within this land at least, organized annihilation had been broken, leaving world fragile yet alive beneath watchful silence of one who had died once and refused to let darkness unify again. Chapter 91. The long-duration monitoring protocol ran for months without critical alert, yet Lu Chen did not enter true dormancy. Instead he maintained low-frequency awareness layered beneath rest, perceiving the continent like a sleeping organism whose pulse he could sense without conscious strain. And in that quiet he noticed something subtle: human-made harmonics gradually replacing mutation echoes as reconstruction accelerated. Wind turbines spun again across reclaimed plateaus, rail lines hummed faintly with repaired engines, and controlled industrial activity generated steady mechanical rhythms that reshaped acoustic landscapes once dominated by infected pulses. Analyzing these anthropogenic vibrations, he realized humanity was inadvertently crafting its own continental undertone, not biological but infrastructural, and though benign now, unchecked resonance patterns could interact unpredictably with dormant mutation reservoirs. Rather than intervene forcefully, he began mapping emerging human harmonic grids, ensuring they remained diffuse rather than convergent in ways that might catalyze amplification phenomena similar to the original anchor's geological synergy. Adjusting suppression towers to harmonize gently with new mechanical baselines, he shaped a blended resonance environment where human rebuilding dampened rather than intensified mutation. Observing this interplay from ridge above farmhouse as distant turbines rotated against twilight sky, Lu Chen acknowledged that future stability depended on subtle calibration between civilization's return and plague's remnants, and that guardianship now required guiding harmony rather than waging war. Chapter 92. Zhao's federation eventually consolidated into formal council representing multiple provinces, and though unaware of Lu Chen's existence, their governance incorporated cautious zoning laws limiting high-density construction in resonance-prone valleys. Guided by anonymous environmental advisories he continued to transmit, trade routes stabilized into predictable circuits, and as rail networks reconnected enclaves, Lu Chen monitored vibrational corridors carefully, adjusting diffusers beneath bridges and tunnels to prevent harmonic stacking. During one routine sweep he detected minor flare beneath newly reopened mining complex where subterranean drilling amplified dormant infection pockets sealed for years, creating localized neural agitation. Traveling swiftly to the site, he infiltrated shafts and installed deep dampening nodes that absorbed mechanical vibration while eliminating agitated variants before they matured into coordinated threat. Afterward he transmitted coded warning to council engineers advising revised drilling protocols to avoid resonance thresholds, embedding preventive wisdom into rebuilding efforts. Standing outside mine entrance as workers resumed operations unaware of narrow avoidance of catastrophe, Lu Chen reflected that apocalypse's greatest danger no longer lay in obvious hordes but in subtle interactions between progress and remnants, and that survival in this new era required humility in development as much as courage in battle. Chapter 93. A decade seemed compressed within 2 years of relentless vigilance, and Lu Chen's perception evolved from reactive scanning to predictive modeling, capable of anticipating mutation stress points weeks before harmonic spikes manifested, integrating climate projections, trait expansion maps, and architectural blueprints. He constructed continental simulation forecasting zones where evolutionary pressure might concentrate. One such projection highlighted borderland grasslands where livestock expansion overlapped with residual infected populations surviving in irrigation canals, and upon investigation he discovered hybrid strains feeding primarily on animals rather than humans, reducing immediate threat yet sustaining mutation continuity, rather than eradicate them completely. He instituted containment ring using low-intensity dampeners and advised ranchers through anonymous channels to rotate grazing patterns, minimizing sustained interaction that could drive further adaptation. The strategy preserved ecological buffer while preventing strain from escalating toward organized hierarchy. Observing herds grazing under open sky once dominated by fear, Lu Chen accepted that coexistence, carefully managed, might serve better than total annihilation of every remnant, provided vigilance remained constant.
Yet he remained alert to possibility that hybridization pathways could produce unforeseen adaptations, and he stored genetic profiles of the strain within bunker archives for future reference.
Chapter 94. Mid-spring brought first coordinated scientific expedition organized by Federation to study infection remnants systematically rather than merely avoid them, and though Lu Chen observed from distance, he recognized significance of this shift from fear-driven survival to knowledge-driven inquiry. The expedition established secure perimeter around abandoned research campus and began cataloging dormant infected specimens under strict acoustic shielding protocols, unknowingly mirroring principles he had refined over years. He monitored their resonance containment equipment carefully, prepared to intervene if miscalibration risked amplification, yet their cautious methodology proved effective, demonstrating humanity's growing competence. When minor harmonic spike emerged due to generator malfunction, Lu Chen discreetly triggered remote dampener to stabilize field before cascade occurred, allowing scientists to correct error without realizing external assistance. As data collection progressed, he contemplated whether revealing portions of his accumulated knowledge might accelerate safe understanding without exposing himself, but he restrained impulse, recognizing that gradual, self-earned advancement fostered resilience. Standing beyond campus boundary at dusk, he sensed fragile but genuine partnership emerging between human intellect and disciplined caution, a contrast to reckless experimentation hinted at in old virology files, and he acknowledged that perhaps the future would not require solitary sentinel forever if humanity learned to respect resonance physics underlying its own survival. Chapter 95. Summer heat intensified across southern provinces, and with it came renewed mutation activity in humid wetlands where dense vegetation trapped warmth and sound, forming micro-resonance chambers conducive to low-tier coordination. Lu Chen traveled south to observe marshlands where scattered infected congregated among mangroves, their pulses faint yet synchronized intermittently through echoing waterways.
Instead of immediate elimination, he experimented with environmental modulation.
By altering water flow through strategic debris removal, disrupting acoustic channels that allowed pulses to reinforce each other, over weeks, wetlands' harmonic profile flattened, and infected groups dispersed naturally without requiring direct combat. The experiment confirmed that ecosystem management could neutralize evolutionary pressure efficiently, reinforcing his transition from warrior to regulator. However, he also observed crocodilian predators adapting to feed upon infected more frequently, raising question of cross-species interaction and potential long-term ecological shifts. Collecting samples discreetly, he confirmed no immediate mutation transfer yet logged possibility for vigilance. As humid nights settled over quiet marsh and fireflies flickered above still water, Lu Chen recognized that world was entering complex phase where plague integrated into environment rather than dominating it, and that balance, not eradication, defined realistic horizon of survival. Chapter 96. Reports from northern tundra indicated declining infected numbers due to harsh winters and absence of dense human activity, and Lu Chen extended perceptual sweep across those regions, finding only scattered, weak pulses fading gradually with each season. For first time since awakening in Beijing apartment, he sensed entire swaths of land nearly free of mutation presence, ecosystems reclaiming abandoned spaces without interference from coordinated predators. The realization stirred
cautious contemplation. Perhaps with sustained equilibrium, infection might eventually recede into isolated relic populations incapable of global threat, yet he tempered optimism with memory of anchors rise from hidden geological cradle, understanding that complacency allowed seeds to germinate unnoticed. Reinforcing long-range monitoring algorithms and installing autonomous drones and remote mountain chains,
he ensured that absence remained verified rather than assumed. Returning south, he observed children planting saplings along former highway medians, symbolic acts of reclamation he had once deemed impossible amid sirens and betrayal. Though he remained unseen, he allowed brief stillness watching young trees sway in warm breeze, acknowledging that his relentless vigilance had carved space for such moments to exist without imminent annihilation. Chapter 97. An unexpected harmonic anomaly surfaced not from mutation but from experimental energy plant built by Federation engineers utilizing geothermal resonance for power generation, and Lu Chen immediately detected structural similarities between plant's vibrational output and early anchor harmonics, albeit weaker. Traveling swiftly to facility, he analyzed reactor chambers and identified feedback loops where geothermal drilling intersected with mineral-rich strata capable of amplifying vibrations beyond safe thresholds. Engineers, unaware of resonance theory's implications, celebrated efficiency gains that subtly edged toward dangerous coherence. Intervening anonymously, Lu Chen transmitted detailed modifications advising installation of phase cancellation arrays and redistribution of load cycles to prevent harmonic stacking. After adjustments were implemented, plant's output stabilized without compromising energy supply, averting potential creation of artificial anchor-like undertone. Observing turbines spin smoothly within safe parameters, he recognized profound truth: humanity's technological resurgence carried potential to recreate conditions that once birthed catastrophe, and only integration of hard-earned resonance knowledge could prevent history from repeating in new form. Chapter 98. Years now layered upon initial rebirth, and Lu Chen's internal resonance architecture had matured into stable, balanced cadence requiring less conscious modulation, yet he continued periodic pruning of accumulated traits to avoid drift. During one deep recalibration session he revisited memory of Wei Dong, not with rage but as origin point of path that had reshaped continent, and acknowledged that betrayal, though catalyst, no longer defined his purpose. The bunker that once symbolized isolation now functioned as nerve center of continental equilibrium, its steel doors less prison than foundation, extending perception outward. He sensed continent breathing steadily beneath patchwork of human settlements and muted mutation pockets, no undertone dominating, no consortium assembling. Zhao's Federation had evolved into generation that scarcely remembered first sirens except as cautionary history, and reconstruction advanced cautiously, guided by resonance-aware principles. Embedded subtly across infrastructure, standing above farmhouse at twilight, Lu Chen felt neither triumph nor exhaustion, only sustained readiness, aware that evolution's ambition never fully vanished, merely waited for imbalance. Yet for now, balance held, forged through discipline and refusal to yield when world once devoured him. Chapter 99. One quiet night beneath starlit sky, Lu Chen detected faint harmonic whisper far beyond previous range, so distant it resembled memory rather than signal, and for long moments he analyzed it carefully, discerning pattern not of apex consolidation but of scattered micronodes flickering in synchrony across oceanic distances. Whether echo from foreign continent or atmospheric anomaly, he could not determine with certainty, but the whisper carried neither urgency nor organized thrust. Instead of mobilizing immediately, he logged anomaly within predictive matrix and adjusted satellite relays to gather additional data over time, choosing measured observation rather than reflexive campaign. Years of relentless conflict had taught him that not every tremor heralded catastrophe, and that disciplined patience prevented unnecessary escalation. Watching constellations drift slowly across sky once obscured by smoke and fire, he understood that guardianship required wisdom as much as strength, and that balance sometimes meant waiting, allowing distant patterns to clarify before intervention. Within quiet hills of Sichuan, fields rustled peacefully, and no horde thundered in darkness, testament to transformation wrought through countless unseen battles. Chapter 100. At dawn marking third anniversary of his rebirth, Lu Chen stood upon ridge above concealed bunker and extended perception across continent one deliberate time, scanning mountains, rivers, cities reborn in fragments, and distant plains where only faint embers of mutation persisted. He felt no anchor's undertone, no braided symbiosis, no rotational consortium, only scattered life and fragile equilibrium, humanity rebuilding with caution, mutation lingering without unity. The world remained imperfect, scarred, unpredictable, yet no longer balanced upon edge of orchestrated extinction. Steel doors beneath farmhouse rested silent, hydroponic lights glowing steadily below, and distant wind turbines turned in harmony with landscape rather than against it. Remembering final moments of his first life, teeth, and betrayal and darkness, he recognized how narrowly the world had escaped descent into irreversible hierarchy. This time, mercy had died when he turned off the intercom. Yet from that ruthless resolve emerged guardianship that prevented apocalypse from unifying again. As sun rose fully over Sichuan hills, casting warm light across fields reclaimed from ruin, Lu Chen allowed himself a single measured breath free of imminent threat, then resumed quiet watch, knowing that as long as evolution dared to gather strength against humanity's fragile persistence, he would remain the unseen counterpoint, disciplined, patient, and ready to sever any root before it bound. The world in darkness once more.
If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next chapter, and share your thoughts in the comments below.